I don't have the option to share.
Oh, come on. Oh, it's because I'm in the middle of sharing. Let me stop sharing. Sorry.
Okay. That's okay.
All right, I've stopped. Now you should be able to go.
Okay. All right. So I chose this lumber mill in Louisiana. It's got pretty cool historical context. It's kind of like a city built around this milling industry that was kind of emerging in the turn of the century. So kind of like looked at the housing community that was built around it, but then focused on the sawmill complex. And there's some great provided axons that kind of really laid everything out. I just like kind of organized it into its primary functions for like each zone. But so I guess that's my question. So here's the main sawmill building, which is the orange here. And it's pretty cool, and there's great information provided about the structural systems and everything. Yeah, so I guess that's where I'm a little bit lost as to so initially I kind of dove into modeling the planer mill, just because I thought it was kind of unique and interesting, and it's like its take on form, like as a typology, and it also like they in one of the articles talks about like how it's just this open air kind of naturally ventilated space, because of all the sawdust and stuff that's just kicked up, and it's an extremely like hot and humid climate. So I'm not going to go into the rest of it, but then I started kind of I'm new to Revit, so I started. Do you still see my screen?
No.
Oh, oops. So I started modeling in Revit, and that's slow, but yeah. I just started kind of modeling out the structural system, and yeah. So I guess now I just need to know like what your thoughts are on kind of that my approach to it, and whether I should just stop what I'm doing and start modeling the main building, or.
So I think you're going down a fine route. I think it's because, again, I think you could pick any one of those buildings. You could even pick the housing related to it, right? Which, again, I think when Courtney presents hers, I think we'll find that that's the route she's sort of going. And I think it's going to be different. This is where it's going to be kind of tricky, because everybody's project has different scope and scale related to what it's doing, right? So I think that the route you're going looks fine, and I think you're going to find that at this scale of thinking about building a shelter, right? You're looking just at that planar building, but again, you're considering things. You're looking at just the material makeup of that shelter, right? What's it accomplishing? What's it made out of? And just sort of accounting for all of those things, okay? And then when we zoom in and say, what's happening in that building and how does that maybe relate to the way it's made up, you're going to find that there's going to be similarities between that and those other buildings as part of the larger complex, right? So even though you don't maybe necessarily do that analysis, you'll understand the relationship between what you've done on this one building and how it might be applied to those other buildings, right? Okay. And then at the same time, when we step back and say, all right, let's look at this project in the larger context of the wood industry, forestry practices, milling practices, all of these things that when we want to think about how these buildings operate in the larger world system, that you'll have to kind of think about your little planar mill building in the context of the larger mill building, the housing elements, where materials are coming from in terms of forestry practices around this.
Right.
Right.
But I guess it's, yeah.
So you don't, but that doesn't mean you have to necessarily digitally model all of those things, right? Because we're going to use the Emergy sort of systems language as a way to quote unquote model the building and understand the relationships of all of those parts and flows, and perhaps in a way create a mental model or a sort of visual model, diagrammatic model of how those things are all related to one another, right? So even if you don't necessarily, again, have a kind of physical understanding of those buildings at a high level of detail, you'll understand how they're related and the activities that happen in those buildings are related to one another. And I would argue even the way those buildings are constructed, and how that's either similar or different to one another.
I pretty much understand like the role of each of the buildings on the complex.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of all sorted in my mind, and I'm just wondering if like in like when you zoom out, if the actual lumber mill might have more of a role in like the kind of the greater ecosystem.
And it might be right, and that's the thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to then look at building a shelter for that particular building, right? You can still understand its importance and its because what we'll see is when we use this, when we start to think about how we represent these systems, you can get carried away and get into the fine minutia and detail of things, or you can start to aggregate these things and look at them in broad brushstrokes, right? And again, this is where the window we have on the world and the project that we're looking at can be as sort of fine-grained and detailed, or as broad brushstroked as we want it to be in terms of what's useful for what we're trying to understand about the project, right? So in your case, right, why did you pick this particular mill, or why did you pick a mill building, right, or a lumber mill? And what do you hope to, again, kind of learn from it? So what we'll see in the reading for this week that really introduces this methodology in a much more detailed and sort of step-by-step process way, right? Because we've kind of talked about it in, broad concepts, right? Like the first chapter of the sort of textbook piece of it, introduces these concepts of the hierarchy of energy, and Branham's essay kind of starts to put it in light and context in terms of how you could apply it to looking at a particular building. And that's, I think, helpful to clarify why one would want to do this. But it takes the act of actually doing it oneself, right? Like just taking a building apart, thinking about what it's made up of, and then understanding about how that fits into its larger system, as well as in terms of what's happening inside that building. So again, I think when we get into the next step of building a setting, right, here's where you could start to make comparisons and contrasts between what's happening in one mill building versus the planer building versus, right? Like what are these you have these big sheds, right, on this that are all in a way similar building types, but they're housing very different activities perhaps. And how are those activities related to one another? And so I think you're going to see that theme come up with some of the other projects as well, right? So does that kind of clarify a little bit, Brennan?
I mean, so
yeah, okay. It's clear as mud, I know, but it's
it is. I mean, I guess it does. Focusing on this building that's not the main building is might kind of be beneficial to kind of like zooming into just the mill or the overall lumber mill itself, right. Just like kind of hone in on its role,
right?
Because I think everyone kind of knows like the role of the main mill building. Like that's where the logs are made into rough dimensional lumber and all that. And so like the planer mill, like the refining it, I think could play like a pretty interesting role, because you have these inputs from where the log is refined and then kiln dried, and then it goes to the planer mill. But then it has an output kind of area where it's then sent out by adjacent railroad to whatever consumers. And
right. So I think it, especially when you start to think about the chain of hierarchies and transformations of from raw log, right, to finished product in terms of what we specify in a building, right, and that there's all these sort of levels of interaction, right. I think in a way, looking at a mill building like this is really useful because you're literally tracing those transformations through each step of the process, right? And that inherently, I mean, I think it's the most, that's why I'm kind of glad that there's a few of you who are doing very sort of industrial production type buildings, because it's most clearly, I think, connected to what this methodology is trying to show, which is that all buildings, all systems are a series of these inflows, these production methods of production and consumption that cause these sort of autocatalytic feedback loops, right? Where you have, inputs into a production that goes into something that then gets consumed, that then inevitably will feed back into that production mode somehow, right? I think it's most sort of explicit and most direct in a building like what you're doing, right? Or a complex of buildings like what you're doing. So yeah, I think you're right in that maybe not focusing on the main mill building will cause you to sort of better understand and start to connect all those pieces together, right? So let's keep going, and then we'll hopefully come full circle to some of these things, especially as we look at some of the other projects. All right, so why don't you stop sharing? I'll share then, or you did stop sharing, didn't you? Yeah, sorry. I'll share the Miro board. Has everybody else been able to get at least some stuff up on the Miro board, hopefully? All right, everybody see that? Okay, so who wants to go next? Anybody, any takers? Otherwise, we'll just kind of.
I can go next.
Alex, all right.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna do the annoying thing where I bring everybody to to Alex's board, and then again, if you have to go back and check out your stuff, that's totally fine, or keep tweaking your things. But can everybody see this pretty clearly? Okay.
All right. So I found this really cool video. I mean, I found a couple of historic videos of it. We don't have to play that right now. But then if you guys recall, I was looking into the Omaha Stockyards exchange building. But then kind of looking into the history of why it was there and everything, you realize that the building was just a part of this network of other things that were on the site. The bottom row shows some, the first one is the process to get cattle through the feeder. So one of the reasons that the whole stockyard started was because they used to just hold the stock for people, and while it was being sold. While it was being sold. So then eventually they started feeding them, and then they realized that corn is really good to keep cows fat and lean. So it started being more about feeding and fattening the cattle as opposed to selling it. But I mean, they will still hold auctions daily of the cows. If you move to the right, you start seeing the whole complex. This was the stockyards at its biggest point in the late 50s. And it started, and the pictures on the right kind of show a breakdown of that. So it started off with the cattle feeding. There was one or a couple. You had your hogs, you had your cattle. They also had sheep and horses. They did not eat the horses. The horses were just for transportation. But then you started getting they got a bank on site, and then they got the exchange building, and then just being this whole network of things in the surrounding area. So the following images are just some of the following page are just some of those images from those adjacent down. Some of the adjacent things. So the auto park, bank. This was called Cripples Barn. which was a barn where they would take all the hurt animals or sick animals to help them get better. Then you have the grain tower and some infrastructure to get people around the site. So what I worked on when I zoomed in was working on right now just a bay of the one bay of like of the second cattle pen. So that's the plan section elevation. I haven't modeled the second floor yet, but I think this is kind of what I would like to do. Just model a bay or a bay and a half of the project, because it'll be a lot to model as a whole.
Well, and again, you figure out a bay, right? And for certain, again, this, and I would say this would hold true for a lot of your projects that I've seen so far, right? You kind of really detail and understand it at a bay level, right? And it's just, right? It's just repetitive, right? So, I mean, I think it's a good approach to take, Alex, right? Because it's like, if I can figure everything out in this one little bay, then yeah, there may be some variation here and there, but it in the broad scheme of things, it gives me a pretty deep understanding of how this thing is pretty much everywhere, right?
Yeah. And then I was also kind of wondering about, for building a shelter, getting like an example from the hogs and the sheep too, because they're a little bit different, but not different enough. So it's kind of a variation of
yeah,
one building.
Well, and I think since your building is so simple, I mean, I think that it probably would be a reasonable approach to take, right?
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, I mean, because again, we talked about, this is where I think this is a really good example, to get back to your point, Brennan, where you have this huge complex of buildings, right? Where, I think Alex, why you initially picked it was you were interested in sort of the exchange building them itself, right? And I think there's some fascinating stories to tell with regards to the exchange building, particularly in terms of what it has transformed into now, right? But I think at the same time, I think there's the exchange building wouldn't exist there if it wasn't for all of this other activity that's happening around it, right? So in terms of what you're thinking about in terms of just, again, literally flow of livestock, right? And so again, these little shelters, these little pens and roofs and barns and sort of fairly mundane looking shelters and structures have a huge impact in terms of the activity that's actually happening at this place, right? And then again, as we zoom out and think about the impact of this stockyard and the larger system of food production in this country and all of that, right? I mean, it's huge, right? Its impact is tremendous. And even though when you look at these little pens and these little sheds, you go, well, this isn't very much, right? But you really, I think, it forces you to start to think about what is this thing accommodating, and what is its impact in the larger system, right? So I think this is a great start. I think the approach of figuring out a typical bay, right? This nice correlation to what we were doing in structures last year, right? With if you can understand a bay pretty deeply, you can, for a lot of buildings, you can understand the whole building, right? And so I think it's a good approach to take in terms of modeling this one bay as a way to kind of really easily start to tally and quantify everything. And as long as you set it up in a way that you can account for the total, right, by looking at this one part, that's what matters, right? So I think that looks good in terms of the direction you're going. And I think, like you said, as you start to as we zoom out and think about these shelters in the larger context of the site, it will start to bring up inevitably more questions about how these things are related, how it's different for one animal versus another, right? And how did that go into decisions related to these sort of construction practices related to making these shelters and organizing this, right? What is structure? Structure is just organization, right? It's just how these things are organized to accommodate these activities, right? That is what, if we go back to thinking about structure in a building, right? It's just why structure is so fundamental is because it's truly about making material decisions that literally organize the space, right? And so again, it can be the simplest of means to achieve fairly complex ends, right? And I think this is an example of that kind of building, right? And type, right? And I think, again, we're going to see it, I think, with some of the other ones as well. Whereas, again, if you had dug into the Exchange building itself, that is a much more complicated and complex building with a lot more granularity, right? But I would argue that it'd be the same effect in the end, right? Like if you were to go through and model that whole Exchange building and think about all of like how it's served as an office and then how it now is serving as high-end residential, right? Nothing or very little has changed from an overall structural organization, right? But the activities have greatly changed, right? And so I think this focusing on this aspect of it is I think going to be interesting, and you'll still be able to address those other scales as we kind of move forward. Okay. Do you have any questions, or are you having any difficulties sort of making assumptions about things? So it looks like it's pretty well. Yeah. Okay. All right. And now don't forget what happens underground too, even if you have to make some assumptions, right? But there is some, because you'll be surprised that there's a lot of concrete even underground that you don't see, right? So
there's secret tunnels underground.
And that too, yeah. So again, thinking about how is that all connected as well, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. Good. Anybody who wants to go next? What are you modeling in, by the way? What tool? The software?
I'm using Rhino.
Rhino. All right. Anybody want to go next?
I'll go.
Billy?
Yeah.
All right.
Mine's fairly very simple building, but kind of complex story, I would say.
Yeah. And
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I switched buildings last weekend. I spent like half day trying to look for something, and then found this. It's in Seattle. It's a Boeing plant that was used to make a bunch of B-17 bombers. I think at one point I read that in 24 hours they pumped out like 16 new B-17s. So it was just like a huge production facility. And if you go down, you can see there's like a few different buildings. I'm focusing on these 240 and 241, which yeah, it's just a huge building. I haven't done like a full takeoff, but the interesting part is like this building was camouflaged. So they actually put fake trees and landscape on top. And if you go down again, you can see.
This is a great image. Yeah.
And it was kind of nicknamed Synthetic Street and Burlap Boulevard. Because they used a bunch of burlap and like mesh wire and like plywood houses and stuff. You go down and you can kind of see some more photos of that.
Yeah, I love these where you can see that it's like a half a house, right?
Look at the car and it's like so. Yeah, I think it's really interesting as a storyline, like how the building could have been used, or I don't know. Maybe not.
Well, I think, so I think there's a couple interest. Here's where, again, Billy sent this to me on Saturday, I think, right? And like was kind of spinning his wheels a little bit with that GM Technical Center. And again, I think that would have been an interesting one to look at, right? I have no doubt that we had more time and you had more information available to you. That would have been an interesting study. But I think this is where, a quick switch, right? And starting to look at something that is, in a way, it's a pretty dumb big box, right? But when you look at what that big box is producing, right, which is these, you know, these huge pieces of equipment, and then the story of, well, in order to protect itself in a time of war, right, all the energy and effort that went into creating this, you know, fake city, right, that was meant to sort of shield and hide it from existence, right? There's a really interesting stories in terms of, you know, that the energetics related to that, right? So I think you can't separate that from the production of those planes, right? You have to, that is all part of that same process, right? And so I agree. I think it lends itself for some interesting examination, especially. And here's a great example where, as building a shelter, it's really maybe not all that interesting, right? It's a pretty banal building, right? And that's fine. But when you look at, again, A, what it was producing, you know, the activities it was housing, and B, the sort of larger sort of implications of its role in a larger world system, I think you're going to find that those stories become pretty interesting. And how do you sort of account for that in terms of its larger role and impact within, you know, a larger frame of things. So yeah, so I think, and you've found enough information that you are kind of able to it looks like you've got a lot of photos. And
there's a full construction set that I didn't post in here, but I have like 22 page. If you go down to the bottom, I'll show you like the progress.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So yeah, this is actually from my Revit model, but I'm working on that big main building and just working on a few bays, and then hopefully can just copy it.
Yeah. Again, here's a great example where it's a pretty repetitive bay structure, right? And I mean, again, that's part. I mean, this is true for most buildings, right? You know, you figure out one piece of it and you kind of understand the whole, right? And again, I think there's value in thinking about buildings this way. This is exactly why, you know, it's helpful to just, you know, zoom in and take a piece of the building and understand it really deeply, as long as you understand any variation of that piece to the larger whole, and as long as you can kind of account for the total whole in the end as well, right? So I'm fine with some of you, you know, going deeply into modeling just a piece of it at this point, if that's all you've got, and then thinking about efficient ways that you could start to replicate that pretty easily, especially for, you know, because again, all you have to do is say, how much material is there in one bay? How many bays do I have? And it's just a quick multiplication problem, right? So, you know, so in terms of doing quantity takeoffs, and you worked construction this summer, right? Yeah. So you know the importance of that's all people who build buildings care about, is like, you know, they look at the drawing and what's the first thing they do? They quantify everything. How much material is here? How much, because to do that, then they can start to go, well, how much labor is involved in actually making this? How much labor is going to take to do this? And depending upon how much material is, that matters, right? And then how much is it going to cost to get that material, right? So what we're essentially doing a material takeoff of a building as though we were going to build it, but we're then doing, what we're going to do is just look at that quantification through a slightly different lens of not just its economic cost and value, but its ecological cost and value, right? And so I think those of you who are, you know, who've spent some time in practice, worked in firms, actually maybe built a building yourself or something, you understand a little bit this relationship of the construction process, hopefully. And I think what you'll hopefully start to see is all we're doing is we're looking at that same process, but we're just looking at it through a slightly different lens. So, and you're modeling this in Revit, you said, or?
Yeah, I'm still kind of learning a lot about Revit, so it's taking me longer, but I think it's
but I think that that's good, right? And so I'm again, I'm pretty software agnostic. I don't really I think whatever tool you can use to get the job done is is the tool you should use. I think those of you who want to learn a new tool, this is a great project and exercise to force yourselves to do that. So if you have an eye towards, I want to get a job at the end of this year, right? And you think building your Revit portfolio is going to help that, right? Here's a great exercise to force yourself to model a building in a tool that maybe you're not as comfortable with yet. And again, why Revit is a tool, why Revit is a powerful tool or any modeling software is powerful is what you can do with the data once you start to model it. And I think that's where I'm hoping that you'll see payoff in terms of your ability to start to quantify these things and then take that quantification and do some qualitative analysis of it. So
yeah, I don't know if you've heard of the plugin called Tally for Revit.
Yeah,
that's also another reason that I wanted to do
yeah.
Revit.
No, that's great. I think, and that's so to come and correlate to Courtney's earlier point about some of you who maybe are taking this as an advanced tech elective and want to do other sort of analysis, or who might need to supplement other analyses. So, so the only requirement for those of you who are taking it for 4 credits is that you have to do one additional analysis on top of what we're doing with the Emergy analysis. And it can be at any scale, but it most likely will be at this scale of building a shelter. And it's not that it's due at the end of the term. It's not that it's due in this next week. But so for an instances, you might use something like Tally which is just doing a life cycle assessment, right? Yeah. And so understanding what metric it's using, understanding that process, and then being able to compare that to what we're doing with the Emergy analysis, right? Or another way to interpret it could be, I really want to understand the structural performance of these trusses, or so I'm going to model this in, a tool like RFEM or some other structural analysis tool, put some loads on it, see how it performs, and make some correlations between that performative analysis and what I'm looking at from an energetic standpoint with Emergy. Or, why is this a sawtooth roof, right? It's probably has something directly to do with daylight, right? And maybe I want to understand how I want to use some sort of daylighting analysis tool to understand how this building performs from an analytical standpoint using some of those tools. So it's just a vehicle to basically test different analytical approaches, and that can be what we're doing right now in this course, which is focusing really on the energetics of the building at these various scales. But again, it's a perfect vehicle to do some of these other analyses. And again, the tool that you choose might better facilitate that, right? So again, if there's some plugin you've wanted to explore in Rhino or Revit or whatever, this becomes a vehicle to go deeper with that as well. So I'm glad you brought that up. And again, I think hopefully, Courtney, that starts to maybe clarify a little bit about other approaches people could start to supplement in with this.
Yeah, I might pick your brain about the potential of like larger scale. Yeah.
And exactly. And that's a good point too, is that you might find that you want to maybe do a large, when we start looking at building a site, you want to think about some larger mapping analyses of, and that might be and we can for sure can address that and talk about that. Yeah. Or some of you might want to, when we zoom into setting for living and work, you might want to think about, I'm thinking of like understanding the processes and analyzing in a way, almost like Taylorism of, the work time analyses of some of these activities and maybe how they might change in the light of automation and the technological advances that might have occurred in, since, mill building was built in the beginning of the last century versus what milling practices might be in this century, right? And so you could start to hopefully see where this analysis could occur at various scales, and yes, and it's going to totally be case by case basis that some of you might want to approach that. So, but I think it's at least it's helpful to start that conversation.
So just to wrap up, I guess on mine,
Yeah.
I model in like these piles and also do I model the whole building, or did you say just do a couple bays is fine?
Well, let's start by doing a couple bays really well, right? And if you could do a couple bays really well, I have no doubt that you could do the whole building, right? This is not an exercise in stamina about like and bogging your computers down with giant Revit models. That is not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is, what do you need to model to understand the building deeply, right? Why am I having you do this, right? It's because the act of, you're essentially virtually building the building, right? And anybody who's built anything knows that, you know, especially from a set of drawings, whether you've drawn them or not, or somebody else has drawn, there's interpretation that has to happen, right? And there has to be, you know, what is going on here? What's the sequencing of events that has to happen in terms of making this? Now, you know, you can model things digitally in a computer that ignore the realities of physics and how things would actually be built, but it starts to at least illuminate perhaps some of the issues that come up with how we build buildings, right? And so I'm okay with, for this at this point, just model as much as you need to model to basically be able to quantify everything that goes into this building, right? And so
and it's fine that I do those two big buildings in the center because everything's kind of attached, but the drawings actually have elevations.
Yeah, I think that's fine, because again, just to even to Brennan's point earlier, and to I'm sure other people that are going to start to look at, when you zoom out and think about this plant in its larger context, you're going to address those other buildings in some form or another, right? So it's not like you're totally externalizing those and disregarding them. Yeah. It's just at this point, the window that we're drawing, and so this is again, step one of an energy analysis is, what's your system boundary? So your system boundary are those two buildings, and them as sort of shelter as objects of enclosing space, right? And we are going to zoom out and we are going to zoom in. So, but at this phase, that's fine. That's your window. Okay.
Okay, cool.
All right. All right. This is, hey, Courtney, do you want to go since you have to duck out a little early? Is that okay that I nominate you? Because I'm realizing that this is going to probably take longer than I'd imagined, and I'm okay with that because I think it's bringing up good questions, and hopefully good clarifications for people. But I know that you have to duck out at some point. So did you want to go, Courtney, or can we have somebody else go in the meantime?
If she's not here,
Brian can go next then. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can go. I have some ideas, but mine's pretty. Yeah, I think
Brian, why don't you go? Yeah.
Okay. I'm on the right side next to Kira's. Yes, if you start at that
really
first,
annoying.
Just the images real quick.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the Sloss furnace in Alabama. It's a steel and iron heating furnace group of furnaces on a larger site. If you scroll past the second slide to the third one, the site's a pretty large site. I think it covers like a half mile. There's these really large structures that are all the same sort of, again, like everyone else's projects, seem to follow a bay system in these two different buildings.
Yep.
I'm planning specifically on looking at one of the sort of shelters which house a lot of these different systems within them. So I want to look at not just the shelter, but at first I'll model the shelter. I want to model also these pipes and this sort of like some of the larger systems. So if you scroll up to my systems diagram, which is the second slide.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure everyone is familiar with the old Windows screensaver. I don't know if you can play it. I tried playing it, but I don't think it really does play in this. But it was supposed to be just a little GIF of of like that sort of pipe thing where like a screensaver, it moves around, these pipes keep forming. I wanted to do something like this for my overall
There we go.
shelter of materials, because I think that, you know, this whole site's based off of continuity of steel and iron heated up in these furnaces, and they're somehow having to be transferred all around the site while not losing the heat. So that is obviously with connections in the pipes and things like that. So I wanted to look at that as a shelter, as well as the overall, you know, buildings.
Yeah.
Which.
So I will just, I think that's great. And I think that's, I'll just say, in a way that's starting to get into building a setting of work.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So, and that's great. I think it's great that, because again, what you're starting to capture is the process of the production process of steel and iron, right? And so,
yeah.
And all the flows that are required for that, right? But it's going to be a much finer grain analysis than what, if we just think about building a shelter as object, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But they're directly related. I mean, they're one hugely impacts the other, right?
Yeah, the thinking that went into doing like one of these little fun little things with like a bunch of pipes and different like shapes was that I can relate it to the overall like larger shelters eventually.
Exactly. And I'll say, I would say you can include that in this analysis, because again, there is structure and material there that are, again, there's structure there that's only exists there to support these pipes and things that cause these flows, right? So you can't, I would say, in a way, your analysis of building a shelter is capturing that process as well. But I think when you go more deeply into understanding the flows of those processes, it might be in looking at sort of steel production as a sort of activity and you know, talking almost in a way more generalizing that, right?
Yeah.
In the context of this project, but looking at that analysis, I think in the next part will be helpful, right? And I think it'll be a good lead in, right? Because you're looking at the building, then you're going to think about, all right, what the hell's happening in this building, and what's all of the sort of fine-grained minutia of these flows of material that happens through all this complex of buildings on the site. They're all directly related. So, and as we zoom out then and think about this particular steel production plant in the larger role in the country and in steel production and in its location, right?
Yeah.
We're going to be zooming out and thinking about
I was going to look at like where the metal comes in from eventually, and then how much actually is produced from this plant, like how many buildings have been made, maybe say from that plant.
Right. And again, this is where you're not, you know, how accurate can you be on that with this, right? Well, you can only be as accurate as the information you have available to you, right? So, you know, you might find some of these historic documents have a ridiculous amount of information that might have some of that data available to you, right? But at the same time, you might just be able to look at, even somewhat anecdotally, what role what maybe even just some significant projects that were maybe produced at this particular plant, right? So I think that's great. I think that it sounds like you're in a good place, and I think that
I'll probably be using Rhino to just model that structure that was on the like last slide, the section.
So the larger truly this bay, right? Because again, I mean these walls, they exist to support that gantry crane, which exists to move material, right?
And then just to block from like, you know, rain and things in Alabama that, you know, they don't want getting into there.
Right. Exactly. I mean, exactly. If this process could happen out in the air, it would, right? I mean, because why would? Because it takes money and energy to build this shelter, but you have to protect it because of, again, the equipment, right? And then I think what could be interesting as you zoom in to thinking about that flow of processes is how has that changed perhaps in the time since this building was built and how it operated and what maybe is more contemporary practices related to steel production and right?
Yeah.
And you know what I'm saying, right? That this is where I think we'll start to see the ripple effect at multiple scales but I think for this point, let's really just dig into the building as shelter as object. And I
Okay.
appreciate your ambitions about what you want to do. It's exactly aligned with the goals of this project, right? Is that you're thinking about the next scale down and then also the next scale out, right? So, but the key is how are all those things related, right? And that's at the end of the term, that's what you'll hopefully start to have a story about, okay? And an understanding of, okay? So I think that it's great. I mean, this is a great picture in terms of.
Yeah, there's not very many that they don't usually take pictures of their ceiling. It seemed like they like to take the pictures of the systems itself. So it was hard.
Yeah.
That was like the only one available, but
Yeah, I mean, but it's
exterior photos are really nice to see like how it's aged and like
mhm.
the plants on the outside have now kind of grown into the interior.
Yeah, nature takes over.
Yep.
Yeah. Is it still operational?
They use it as more of this. I was told by actually Kyla. I hadn't read into, how it worked, but they now just use it for like an art, sort of making like a iron sort of artwork, and they use it as like
Okay.
a place. Yeah.
So just specialty.
So I think they
stuff
they closed down a lot of the systems and probably only kept open like a very minor furnace to like
Mhm.
heat up. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. Good. I think again I think it's you had picked Crown Hall initially, right? And I think that this project in a way brings up larger questions related to steel and architecture.
And like this could actually show how a building like that Crown Hall was actually came into construction.
Yeah, everything that goes into this sort of polished steel and glass object that we sort of revere, right? I think that's great. I think it's great. Okay. Courtney, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Did you want to? I know you have to duck. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Is it
Sorry, say it again.
a note? I sent you a note. I'm currently driving for a site visit, so
you're
I
in a
don't
car.
even have access yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm zooming in, but I can't.
No. That's totally fine. Okay. Be safe. Okay. So.
I can go next if we need someone.
Sure. Let me. Before we leave Brian, were there any sort of pressing questions, things you were maybe confused about or having any issues finding, or are you doing pretty well? You've got enough sort of.
No, yeah, I've got a lot to go off of. So
Okay.
yeah, it's just about modeling now.
Okay. And what tool are you using? You said Rhino?
Rhino, yeah. And then I'll
Okay.
probably just do like I usually take all my stuff into Illustrator and do nice little diagrams. So I'll probably do some things.
Okay. All right. Great. All right, Isaiah. Let me get back to the Miro board.
All right. So again, I'm doing the Whole Oaks Lumber Company. Played a pretty big factor during the Great Depression. It was a economy booster, creating jobs and creating materials for housing throughout the Great Depression. And I kind of just broke it down, kind of thinking of it as a body. So looking at the core, this is basically the sawmill. This is the big factor, but the structure itself is the shelter for the heart, which is on the next slide. The heart of this whole sawmill is this humongous bandsaw that cuts the up to like 9 foot in diameter logs. And then from there,
can you share your screen?
Oh, you don't see it?
Oh, just so we can follow along with exactly
sure.
what you're doing.
Is it not? I'm sorry. You're not seeing it on the Miro board?
Yeah, you gotta just open.
I'm the mirror board's cutting in and out for me, so
Oh.
it's helpful when the
I could share
speaker
real quick,
can
yeah.
control it and then
Let's see.
kind of navigate for me or for
Sure.
us.
Yeah. Can you share?
Do you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
So as I was saying, the structure serves as the core for the heart of the mill, with this humongous bandsaw, and then from this heart itself, it gets spread out through the arteries of the trimmer. So once it's actually cut from the larger piece, it's then sent back and forth through the trimmer to get dimensioned and cleaned up. This is what I was kind of looking at more, the core that protects the heart. So this is the main building I'm looking at currently. And this is kind of the Rhino model I'm kind of building up on at the moment.
To follow through with your analogy, I would say these are actually the ribs, right? I mean, what,
Yeah.
you know, right? I mean, what protects the heart, right? It's really
The ribs.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in a way, I'm just, you know, but I think it's a fine analogy, but I think it's, you know, so what are you modeling then?
So right now I model majority of the shelter. I'm still working on the edge of where the actual bandsaw is. It's expanding out that way. But so this is kind of what I've modeled so far. I want to eventually figure out and model some of the machines and the conveyor belts. I enjoy doing that small detail stuff.
And again, just like with Brian, I think that's going to be applicable when we get into the next scale, right? When we go zoom down to think about building as setting for work in this case, right? Which is those activities that are, because again, this is another great example. It's just a dumb shed. It's really just really open air dumb roof, right?
Yeah.
That is really just there to protect the equipment. And same with what Brennan was dealing with, right? You have huge production of sawdust and things like that. So you don't necessarily want a confined space because you want that stuff to be able to kind of blow around. But I think really thinking about and understanding this structure and sort of object as a shelter at this point, right, for that activity. And then as we zoom into the next scale and think about setting of work, we'll get into more questions about the kind of equipment and, you know, the fact that this was is a steam powered plant, right? And, you know, the energy and material inflows that go into that side of the production, and how that's perhaps different than maybe, you know, what's happening in Brennan's plant or mill, or even what might be happening in more contemporary sawmills, right? So,
Yeah, and then
so this is your attempt at starting to diagram those flows out.
Yeah, so basically the whole sawmill as the shelter itself, and it shelters and creates opportunity for different things. So as you can kind of see, like it starts on the cut, the logging site, and then you have all these equipment, the loggers, all their input goes into the sawmill, but the sawmill doesn't run on its own. You need power, you need machinery, you need the structure to protect the machinery, and then workers for the mill, and kind of like all this kind of works together into the sawmill, and then the output is the building materials, and then that creates construction, which creates jobs, and it kind of goes into silver projects and housing, and then kind of into society, and then that kind of creates its own interplex and looping.
Right. So here's where, again, I think, you know, your the boundary that you've drawn there as site, right? I think, you know, you could argue that it's actually bigger than just the physical property boundaries of, you know what I mean? And that's what you're mapping here, right? So, but I think what you're trying to capture is what's coming in from outside this place, and where does that then go off to, right? And so I think it's great. I think this is a great first stab at starting to map out and diagram those flows, because again, here's where you could, and here's where you really are. You're literally zooming into, you know, that sawmill building as wood structure, you know, what you have here as wood structure, and really kind of deeply going into and quantifying what makes that up, right? And all of the energy involved in the production of just that object that actually then facilitates all of these other connections and relationships, right? So it's intentionally meant to be a fairly constrained problem at this point, where we're just looking at this one scale. But it's good to hear in terms of what you're thinking about, in terms of where you'll go moving forward with the next phases, where we're zooming in and thinking about it as setting, building as setting, and then zooming out and thinking about building as site. So I think this is a great start. And what tool did you say you used for modeling? Rhino?
It's
Revit.
Rhino. I was trying to do Revit at first, but I could work a lot faster in Rhino, and just I work better in Rhino.
Yeah, and so again,
wrong with Revit, but
again, my mindset is whatever tool helps you get the job done, right? And I think we can talk more in depth about how you can start to get some, do some takeoffs and get some quantities of this to help you start to do these calculations of how much material is here and all of that. But this is a great first step at getting there, right? Is you kind of just have to, you had to know how big all these things were to actually model them that way, right? So, okay, all right. Any things that you're kind of hung up on or questions?
Not at the moment. I just think the biggest thing for me is just focusing on a scale.
Yeah.
I look at one thing and then I expand or zoom in. It just
and we will get there. Yeah, exactly. We will get there, and that's why I think it was helpful just to diagram that out, right?
Yeah.
Even just kind of roughly there, because at least it tells you in your mind where you want to go with it, right? And similar to what Brian had just done as well, right? I think his ambitions to go really deeply into the machinery and then zoomed out and think about the context of this in the larger whole of steel production and everything. And you could do the same thing, right? Especially because there's really interesting stories about the history of this place. A lot of it was made just by the people who were who owned it, right? Like they were literally just building what they needed to do the task at hand, right? But how that has persisted over quite a long period of time, and as well has adapted over time too, right? And I think that's where, when you go in one more scale to as building a setting, that's when you can start to even look at some of those other relationships outside of the sawmill building, but that are related to a finer grain scale, right? So I think that's great. Okay.
Cool.
Yep. All right, who wants to go next?
I can go next.
Joe? Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't you just share screen? I think Brennan was right. It's easier, I think, just to share screen, take over the Miro board, if you're comfortable with that. Otherwise, I'm happy to navigate.
Okay, I can share the screen.
Okay.
I also think if Joe clicks on his icon at the top, then he'll be presenting and our screens will just follow his.
Oh yeah, if you go, exactly. If you click on your thing and even say bring everyone to me, if you click on your little icon in the upper right hand corner and there's a little thing that says bring everyone to me, and if you click on that, everyone should get sucked into where you're going.
No.
And in their own Miro boards. So
sorry, I cannot find this.
So right where your hand is, right, there's a little circle with your JZ in the. Click on that and then say bring everyone to me, and now everybody's there.
Okay.
All right.
So the choice I got is the Falling Water House. The main reason I chose this building because this term I'm taking 20th century American architecture history. I found this architecture building is really interesting, and also as we all know, the architect Frank Lloyd Wright is really kind of like a really controlling architect. He wants to design everything as his desire and willingness. So actually, this building is a really good architecture, but it's not really a good house for the owner. because it's built over the waterfall, and the noise is caused a lot of mental discomfortableness for the owner. And also when the owner wants to enjoy the view of the waterfall, they have to go across the river and seeing from the other side of the building. And I got, because it's a really famous building, so I think I got more than enough documentary for this building. I got plan section and even some details. And also I got this model. So in terms of the architecture as shelter, I'm thinking of to deep in how the different materiality performs differently in these rooms, including glass, steel, and concrete and masonry, and also for the stone masonries, there are different thickness for the wall. So I assume they could perform differently. But my question is, how can when I considering building as setting, because my building is different from others people's, because they are doing something like an industrial building, produce something, but for this one it's just like a normal residential building. So
well, but I mean, it's a setting. It's setting as living, right? It's building as it's the most sort of, I would argue, it's one of the most fundamental types, right? It's so you're going to be looking at how, and I think you're already starting to imply what sort of matters, right? Is how do you create a building that, or how does the building reinforce the activity of living, right?
Yeah.
And so this is a very sort of specialty case, right? It's a first of all, it's like a vacation house, right? For this family, this very well off family. But I think it's exactly what you're starting to maybe speak to, is how does the materiality, how does the relationship to site, how does the organization of the building facilitate those activities of living, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that, in a way, it's that simple. And yes, in a way, it's different from what some of the other examples we've seen thus far, where it's a much more clear, this is building supporting an industrial process, right? But I'd say this is just as important, and you could make just as similar comparisons and discussions related to how does the organization of this material that you sort of laid out, right? Concrete, glass, masonry, steel, wood, right? All of the things that make up the building, how does it facilitate at the next scale down those activities of living, right? And you talk to some of the things in terms of the auditory aspects of being near the fallen, being near the waterfall. I mean, they why did Wright build it there? Because that they used to picnic on the rock, the family picnicked on the rock there, right? And this was their place they would always go and visit. And they instead of building it where you're looking at the waterfall, you build it where you're engaged and actively part of the waterfall, right? So I think we can talk more individually, specifically about where you'll go with that in the next phase, and then even zooming out and thinking about it in terms of its implication on site. And I would argue, as you alluded to, its importance and its significance in terms of just the canon of modern architecture, right? I mean, you could talk about its impact and with regards to that as well, as we zoom out, scale out. But I think at this point, you're going down the right path of just thinking about it as this makeup of materials and how it and what is that sort of composition of materials, as a shelter, right? For the elements. In this case, it's not only doing the basic requirements of protecting us from climate and things like that, but it has this additional factor where it's literally perched on a waterfall, right? So that inherently brings up some implications in terms of its organization and structure and as shelter that I think you could address at this scale. Does that make sense, Joe?
Yeah.
Okay.
But to be honest, I think this building is not like a great example of how building protect people from environment condition. It's kind of like a really bad example.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, that's debatable. I mean, I think, you know, I think you can, and maybe it's better to look at some of the ways Wright addresses. I mean, the part of the problem is we are so far removed from when Wright was doing these projects that we take for granted some of the pretty revolutionary things that he did in terms of space planning for residential living, right? Like things that are ubiquitous now were pretty novel at the time, right? And in terms of, and that Wright was sort of fundamentally involved in that production. So, you know, and if that's your position, is that you think this is a bad house, right? I mean, I think that's fine, right? I think, but remember that that's sort of a value judgment based on your understanding of what you think a shelter should be for a living, right? So I think just be careful to, and I'm not saying, I'm not disagreeing with that value judgment on your part, but I'm just saying at this phase, I think that gets more into the analysis at the next level, the next scale that we're going to look at, which is drilling down into setting, how is this an effective setting for living? I think at this point, think just about the material makeup, because I mean, you know, think about the terraced outdoor spaces, the sort of broad overhangs that, you know, do shelter from the climate and the environment, and how it does engage with and how it does connect you with your place and environment at the same time, right? So I hear your point, and I appreciate that sort of perspective, but I'd also just say, think about it in a way more generally as well. Okay. About how it's doing those things, and at this point, really just what's the material makeup and how it achieves that. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
So, and you've got plenty of information. Oh, one last question, Joe. So you said you picked it because you're taking a class in modern architecture. History.
American architecture.
Who's teaching that? Egner. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Are you using this for a project related to that course at all?
No.
No. Missed opportunity. Double dip. That's my motto. But okay. Okay. Great. Thanks, Joe. So it's 10 o'clock now. Did you guys want to take a break? Are you guys a little Zoom fatigued already?
Sure.
We could maybe do a 15-minute break and then come back, do a few more, and then do a 15-minute break. I think the time it's taking to go through these is okay. It looks like I'm getting some thumbs up there. I think that sounds good. Let's do a 15-minute break. We'll reconvene at 10:20. Then we'll probably do another break partway through. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about next steps and more general sort of ideas about where we're going with this. Okay. But I think hopefully that this is a helpful conversation at this point, just seeing what people are working on and doing. So let's all take a break. We'll reconvene at 10:20 and go from there. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Okay. So who would like to present next?
I can go.
Okay. Why don't you just share screen? I think that worked pretty well. I think just, yeah, but it's just nice having all the material in one place to reference back to if we need
to. Okay, so yeah, I did the plantation again in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana. And this is the Africa House. It's pretty cool. I chose to model it, obviously. And I can get pretty detailed with it because it's really good information and documentation. Yeah. This is what the quantities in cubic feet. I'm not sure if that's the best way to do that, but that's what I've got from the model so far.
That's great.
But essentially it's just brick on the bottom, timber on top, and the timber on top is actually, the original construction didn't really use any nails. It's all dovetailed together, and now they're like pieces stuck in here.
So
okay,
Kiara,
yeah.
your microphone is, your voice is cutting out a little bit. So I don't know if you have something blocking your mic. But.
Okay, can you hear me now?
It's a little muffled.
Okay, I'll just hold the microphone here then. But yeah, so the top construction part doesn't really have any nails, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I just broke it down into, there's some wrought iron bars on the bottom windows, mostly timber and some brick on the bottom. And that's about it. This is like a history of the plantation. It's pretty fun. Here's my model. Here's a description that I'm quoting from somewhere, but it kind of gives a good idea. And so, yeah, this shape is kind of like kind of unprecedented. People don't really know where it came from, but there's some people think it was like based on buildings in the Congo. That's definitely something I wanted to like do more research into. I mean,
yeah,
I probably won't be able to get like a definitive answer, but it's still cool.
Yeah. No, this is great. This is Rhino, right? Your modeling.
Yes. Yeah. I don't have like the shingles and everything yet.
Oh,
so.
Come on. No, but you don't need, so you don't need the shingles though, right? You just need the surface area.
Yeah, I guess so.
And then go, all right, how big is the shingle, or how much material, how much volume of material is that, right?
Yeah.
So again, that's where level of detail, right? That, what do you need, and what can you kind of capture in terms of just using the model as best you can for calculating out areas and surface areas and volumes and things like that, right? So.
And then you may notice this looks different from the previous one. That's because it's a different house. I couldn't really decide between the two of these, so I might do both / Mark told me to do both. I haven't modeled this one yet, but I mean, they're both pretty simple buildings, especially compared to like the big industrial ones other people are doing. Like it's like really well mapped out, like the materials. I wanted to do this one because the infill between the structure is a mixture of clay, Spanish moss, and like deer hair to make the material. I don't know, but this is cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, so both of these, like the materials are all pretty local, and they're built by like, the people who live there. That's a picture of the other house. So these are the two oldest houses on the plantation. And this is not very helpful, but the big house is right here.
Yeah. But these two buildings are actually in that close proximity to one another? Okay.
Yeah, they are.
Okay. Well, I mean, what's nice about this diagram right here is your system boundary, right, is that box you just drew right there, right?
Yeah.
You could argue that you're looking at these two buildings, and perhaps even how these two buildings as shelter, and how they're related to one another to some extent, how they're similar, how they're different. And then as you drill down deeper into building a setting for the activity that housed in each of these, right? You can maybe, there may be some correlations between that. But then more importantly, obviously, as we've talked about, as you zoom out and think about building a site, there's obviously going to be relationships between not just these two buildings, but even all the other buildings on the site.
Yeah.
Right? And even the bigger context of the place, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I kind of wanted to, I feel like this, like you kind of go back to the timeline up here. It kind of lends itself to like kind of like a change over time sort of perspective. So and because these are the two earliest buildings that could. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Because we haven't, we tend to think about scope in terms of the spatial scope, right? But you bring up a really important point, and in your project's not alone in this, is that there could be really interesting temporal scope and scales that one could think about with regards to all of these projects, I imagine.
Yeah.
But this one in particular. So I think that's even more justification to say, you know, these two buildings were built first, and then what propagated around that as a result of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, this is a good example because this was built in 1800, but then in the 50s and 60s, there was a bunch of artists and like writers who the plantation was turned into like a writer's like retreat, and people like William Faulkner wrote there, and like this is Clementine Hunter, and she was a cook and she worked on the plantation, and she like picked up some paints and painted the whole interior of the upstairs of this. So yeah, I just kind of want to include both of those timelines somehow.
Yeah, that's great. Good. So you seem like you're in a good spot.
Yeah. I think the only thing I'm a little worried about is because the uses of these both of these houses change so much over time, and it's a little like uncertain. When I go into like the setting, it might zoom out into more plantation. Like,
well, you may again yes, the scales might actually change, even though you're zooming in kind of conceptually to a more focused activity. In a way, temporally and spatially, you can even imagine you're zooming out in a way, right? Simultaneously.
Yeah, that's kind of what.
And that's okay. That's okay. Yeah. And again, this is where there's going to be nuance, and everybody's going to be slightly different because there is such a wide variance between all of these project types, right? And again, I think that's okay, right? I think it's more important to just contextualize why you're focusing on what you're focusing on. And I think you've done a good job of telling the story about, you know, these were the first two buildings that were built on this site, and that's partly a good reason why to just focus on them in particular. But it's not like you're ignoring everything else, right? You're going to get there as part of that story. It's just you kind of have to build the story, build the story up, right?
Yeah.
So great. You got plenty of information, right? And I think what's nice is and this is important, that the drawings will tell you so much, and then you might have to supplement that with some of the text that's in some of the data sheets and things, right? So it's this kind of reciprocity between all of this information, and part of your task is the detective work of putting all that stuff together for the analysis that you're trying to do and the understanding of the project that you're trying to extract, right? So,
yeah, I think I might email the Association for Preservation of Historic Natchez to see if they have like any more information about like what was happening, because it's kind of hard to find online.
Yeah, because it seems like they do tours and things like that, right?
Yeah, this is a super popular location. Everyone goes there.
Awesome.
Cool. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Nice. Who would like to go next?
I can go. Oh, Adrian, you can go.
Kyle, or
sure, I'll go. Let's see.
Kyle, and then Adria will have you go after Kyle. Sound good? Okay.
Let's see. So you guys see my screen, right?
Yep.
All right, cool. So I did the Humboldt Bay Power Plant, which is owned by the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, also known as PG&E. So a little history behind this area is that PG&E bought this 147 acres of land specifically for a power plant in 1952. And they chose this land mainly because it's close proximity to the ocean, which allowed easy access for water for cooling and steam power. But it also made it easy for boats to come and deliver like fuel resources for the power plants. So on this land, there's 3 main units built for the power plant. The first 2 are fossil fuel steam plants, but the most significant of them is Unit 3, which is the world's first privately owned, funded, operated, and commercially viable nuclear power plant. So that's the building that I'm focusing on now. Let's see. So the nuclear power plant was only viable because of the plant's significant or close proximity to the ocean, but also the implementation of a new pressure suppression system. So in this picture here, you can see like them installing this new pressure suppression system, which is basically this giant concrete and steel chamber. It was partially filled with water, and basically it was meant to help depressurize and condense some of this nuclear steam that the power plant was like releasing. And this thing was massive. It was built into the ground, 85 feet below ground, and it had walls that were 4 feet thick. And to top it off, literally, which is kind of funny, there was a 72-ton plug made of concrete and steel that capped the reactor. So this is a giant thing. And I thought it was cool because the data sheet that I was working off of had architectural drawings of this sort of chamber. And I don't know if I'm going to really do anything with that, but like I thought it was interesting to show. I added a site plan of the sort of whole campus of this power plant. So on the left, there's units 1 and 2, and then on the right, which is again, the building that I'm focusing on, is unit 3. And on the right side, I added some floor plans from these data sheets. And as you can see, they are sort of like outdated. It's really hard to sort of read these drawings.
Yeah, I know. Some are, and even with the highest quality TIFF file, it's hard to read them. When you
Yeah,
download
so
it.
I've been having a sort of hard time trying to model this.
Yeah.
It's really hard when you can't read the labels of
Yeah.
the drawings, so it's hard to sort of orientate yourself to where these drawings are.
Right.
So, but I've started to just mass out the main base form of the building.
Yeah.
Show it here. So right now I'm trying to figure out what some of these rooms are, mainly this sort of open area here, and then also locate where the like reactor is in this pressure suppression system. Just for reference, I added some pictures of unit 3 on the right side. And right now, what I have modeled is this sort of base here in this picture. And I'm having trouble also finding sort of like drawings on some of this other parts of the building, like this whole upper part, as well as this, I think it's like a caged off sort of electrical equipment area over here.
Yeah, probably transformers and things like that.
Yeah. Another concern I've been having is that I can't find any really good structural drawings for the building, but most of it seems to be made out of like concrete and steel.
Yeah. Did you in some of the data sheets, did you find any good written descriptions about some of because sometimes they'll even describe the structural system in pretty good written detail, where even if you don't have a drawing of it, you could almost, with at least the rough footprint of how big that space is, you could probably start, and from these photographs, you might be able to start to model some of that stuff out.
A lot of it was more focused on this pressure suppression system, and how that was sort of built. Like there's a ton of architectural drawings on that.
Just that.
I read that a lot, or part of the building at least, was made out of concrete bricks and cement. And I can actually show some of the sections. I think you're looking at the sections now. So this is the data sheet that I was working off of.
Oh, I see. And it's because they're embedded. It's because they're embedded in the report that the quality isn't very good, right? They're not separate image files that you can download from the survey.
I looked, I couldn't find any.
Okay, because you can search. Do you see that number, the hair number CA-2293? Like if you search that on the website, you might find there's other records. You might just, there may not be. It might just be that they've scanned them. This happens sometimes where when they were putting together the report, they've had access to the original drawings and they scan them and they just include them as these little sort of thumbnails just to show you what information the report is based on. But and so you're right. It's a scaled down, scanned, probably poorly scanned, image of a drawing that is pretty old. to begin with. And so the legibility of that is probably pretty poor. So I'd say see if you can, when you do a little bit of more digging in terms of based on that sort of CA 2293 survey number, to see if there's any other files that might be available with regards to that. Okay.
Yeah.
And we can talk individually related to that. But I would say to that end, to that point, I think there's nothing wrong with, and you've already started to do it in a way, is really digging into that suppression system, since, like you said, that's sort of the heart of the facility, right? And quite honestly, from a material standpoint, it seems like it's a pretty substantial amount of the material that goes into
it seems like
this thing. So I think there's nothing wrong with using that and considering that as well, and then just trying to do the best you can with the sort of the shelter that in a way houses that, right? So because it's still, I would argue that it's still part of the shelter, right? It's still, that system is still part of the, in a way, the shelter. It's doing more than that, but it's yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I was also thinking about like what scale of like the boundary as a shelter I would look at first, like the building as a whole, and then if this sort of chamber is like a shelter itself. But I started like doing a systems diagram similar to what Isaias was working on.
Yeah.
So basically what I have here is I have this sort of blue circle which signifies the building envelope, but also like the boundary for this building as a shelter.
Yeah.
And then inside of it, I have the nuclear reactor, and that it reacts with the water boiler, cooling chamber, and this suppression system, all of which produce steam and are sort of exhausted through the cooling towers. And of course, I have people that sort of interact with each of these, but it seems like right now, at least, I'm more focusing on like how the nuclear reactor is part of the system and how it interacts with all that. And then on the left, I have the inputs, mainly ocean water and the fuel resources. And then how that goes into the reactor, it creates nuclear waste and electrical power.
Great.
So I was comparing this with the sort of systems diagrams that were in the reading.
Yeah.
And as well as how a building is supposed to sort of interact as a shelter. And some of them are dealing with wind and sun and how that interacts with the building envelope and how it goes in there. But from what I have here, I wasn't really sure how I was gonna connect that to the sort of interactions I have put inside here right now.
Right.
One of the elements that I saw in the system diagrams and the readings was ambient heat. So I was thinking maybe the sun and wind become like an ambient heat element, and then that's sort of exhausted through the cooling tower as well.
Right. It might very well be, right? Yeah. And I think the next reading is going to dive more specifically into the why we're doing this check-in here now with like what you're thinking about doing and what you've sort of started to be able to document and model at this point, is because the reading for this next week is digging more into the specifics of the methodology. And it will, you're absolutely right. It'll start to hopefully illuminate a bit more what you're just addressing there, which is how do these inputs then interact within this boundary at the scale that you happen to be looking at. And you might find that it's either so aggregated or so minimal that it's maybe not that big of, it's not nearly perhaps as important as the ocean water and the fuel resources, right, that are going into this process, right? But at least you're accounting for it and you're addressing that it isn't that minimal, that it is minimal, right? Or that it's not, because this isn't a building that's really housing human activity necessarily, right? Or minimal human activity, that some of the things related to sun and wind might be minimal, or it's indirectly related to what you spoke to, which is like some of the cooling tower activity and things like that, right? Because I imagine, there's going to be sort of a stack effect that probably caused by the wind and caused by heating of the sun that probably help facilitate the cooling tower, right? So
Right.
that I think you're absolutely right that those things are perhaps somewhat related, but and this is where I really appreciate that you've taken the time to try to start to map this stuff out. I think because we'll find that this process is, it's a constant refinement and, sort of consideration and aggregation, or there's a piece that you said, like you said, you want to maybe drill down into and understand at a finer grain, right? And then you might sort of pull that stuff out more deeply, whereas some of this other bigger stuff it's okay to keep it sort of with the big broad brush strokes, because it's not maybe as significant to the core of what you're trying to analyze and understand for this building, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I personally, I think that the system that you're talking about is pretty interesting, and it seems like it is a huge material component of it. And because it is, I don't want it to be the tail wagging the dog, but because there is a lot of information available to it, it's probably, well, that tells me that it's important to this project, as you sort of aptly pointed out. But I think it's significant from a material standpoint. When you put a 72-ton cap of concrete on something, right, that's a lot of material, right? So clearly it's significant. And so I think just trying to maybe understand a little bit more of that significance is going to be part of this process, right? So, okay. Sorry, I've got people over here doing some yard work in my backyard. I don't know if you can hear leaf blowers in the background. But sorry about that. I'll mute myself.
Yes. So I can pull this up. Yeah, I've been looking at the Frederica Bremer Intermediate School. I found it really interesting that it's gone through a couple of different expansions, and it's actually a condominium complex now. I really searched a lot for an up-to-date floor plan, but I couldn't find any.
So it's not a school anymore. It's not a school anymore.
No, it's actually condominiums. Yeah.
That is fascinating. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I just couldn't find anything with full up-to-date floor plans, and I'm guessing that's because it's people's apartments. Like, it's a little bit higher security if it's where people live. The most recent floor plans I could find were actually from the 1909 renovation, which is when it was expanded due to the increased population in Minneapolis. The next expansion was in 1977 when it was converted into apartments. And that one is what really defines its footprint today. So the analysis that I've done is really just based on the 1909 plans. I'm trying to think of how I could even find the more up-to-date plans. It seems like they're just not out for public use. I also noticed that although there's a lot of technical drawings from 1909 available, they're fairly low resolution because I think they're just photo scans of very large drawings that were hand drafted, and they are kept on the government database, but they're not especially visible. If you zoom in, you'll notice that you can read the drawing titles, but you can't really read any of the dimensions. So I used, I found a couple of dimensions that I could see, and I scaled everything based on that and tried building a model with just the floor plates and interior walls. Structurally, it's both simple and complex. It's pretty much exclusively load-bearing walls made out of masonry, both inside and outside. The floor plates are almost identical with the main arrangement because of that. I was able to look into what's going on in the wall, and I noticed that they added in about a foot of rigid insulation. I wasn't able to figure out which type of rigid insulation, but I imagine that's because of the really cold climate that can also be really hot. And I was wondering, like, how does that add to the energy? Because the original masonry building would have been much lower in energy, but if you add that much insulation to a 44,000 square foot building, that's really increasing its environmental impact. I also drew up a systems diagram, and it's kind of showing how different factors led to more and more renovation of this building. It's been expanded pretty significantly since it was constructed in 1877, and each time it does increase its energy, especially in 1977, when it was completely renovated to become apartments. That's adding in a lot more plumbing systems, electrical wiring, appliances, probably a lot of interior walls. I wasn't able to see a larger scale plan. I did find some with individual unit plans, but I didn't include them because I couldn't quite locate them on the larger plan. But considering the scale of the building, there's probably dozens of people living in it. So it is cool to think about how it functions on larger systems, especially just the fact that it was used as a solution to local housing need. But the issue that I'm running into is just the lack of a up-to-date floor plan and kind of ambiguous technical drawings from 1909, where it's actually difficult to discern where the windows are in some locations, because the line weights, especially since they were all done by pen, don't scale too well when you try and look at it from just a scan. So I've considered reaching out to, I guess, the database with these images, if I could get a higher resolution version. I also found a booklet on Amazon that has higher resolution images, but it still wouldn't be up to date. So I'm just not sure what to do about that.
Okay, so you said it was 1977 that it got converted into the condos?
Yeah.
Do you have any information about who the architect was who did that project by any chance?
Yeah, I don't remember their name now.
I mean, and I guess if they still exist, or
yeah, they do.
So that's another place to reach out maybe and say, to explain what you're doing, and see what information that they might have available, right? Because I guarantee, again, that was 43 years ago, but which is already, a bit of time, right? So you don't know what they're going to have still available, but at least there may be somebody in the firm still that worked on that project that you could at least have a conversation with, and that who might have access to some of their as-builts that they used, or their any of their condo plan drawings that they produced with regards to this, right? So, or they might at least help point you in that direction. So I would say that is a route you could take if you want to. I think you're doing everything the right things in terms of finding something on the plan that you know the size of and scaling it relative to that, right? Making the best assumptions that you can about the masonry wall based on its thicknesses and what you know about masonry construction and all this, right? So you're doing, I think, all the right things at this point, and making, going back to Joe's question at the beginning, right? Is like you get to a point where you have to just start making some assumptions, right? Because you're not everything is going to be documented, you're making good educated assumptions. And I'd say if you can get in touch with the architect that did the renovation, I mean, I think that it's an interesting story that the building lasted for 100 years as a school and now has transitioned for 43 years into a place for living, right? So I think understanding, like, what are they, what's the market rate of those units? Is it high end? I mean, that kitchen doesn't look very high end necessarily, but it looks like a 1970s kitchen, right? So it's a bit, or actually it looks like a 1980s kitchen, but it's a bit dated, but it's probably, I mean, it'd be interesting to understand a little bit about what you can kind of dig up. And I think otherwise, in lieu of that, or in spite of maybe what you can't find, just making the best sort of assumptions that you can for this level of analysis, I think is.
Yeah, I think I did look at some apartment listings, and from what I can tell and what I know about the Minneapolis rental market, it's about average, which is fairly expensive. Minneapolis is not a cheap city to live in, especially if you're actually in the city. I think there was like this really small studio that was about $900 a month, for example. I'm sure the larger units are just exorbitant.
Yeah.
It seems like individual classrooms might have even been converted into some apartments.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, and again, I think that's an interesting. I think that's something interesting to explore in terms of how a building can adapt to a totally different change of use, right? And I think you like the things you addressed in terms of the increase in systems necessary for when it's acting as a school versus when it's acting as all these individual units for people to live in, right? And I think that again, that starts to get to the temporal analysis that one could start to do at a different scale of understanding the difference between how a space can accommodate those very different functions, right?
My main question is how they got daylight in, because if you notice the old gymnasium, I can't imagine how they would convert that into apartments because you need a certain amount of access to the outside for egress.
Right.
So I'm wondering what they did in the middle to make that an apartment complex that actually functions to code.
Yeah, because the large space in the middle is that's the gymnasium that's sort of at the heart of the whole building. Yeah. Well, and again, I think if you can reach out to the architect, if they do still exist, and then again, I think being a student opens a lot of doors with people willing to engage with you, especially if you come at it from the perspective of it's a curiosity and you want to know more about it, right? And it also opens up more just networking opportunities for other people in the discipline that you begin to know, right? And so I think it's I would say try to go that route. I know you had expressed a little bit of concern about whether you should maybe, if this building was a little bit too complicated to focus on for this. But I think what you've done up to this point is a good start. And I think you have a good grasp on at least the general sort of material makeup and the quantities that you've started to already kind of gather. So I think you're in a good position in my book. You've maybe had to make a lot of assumptions, but again, I think that's okay, right? Because you're making sound assumptions, right? As sound as you possibly can. And I think as long as you qualify those assumptions, that's the best we can do, right? I mean, I think there's still a lot of interesting things to discuss and understand from this project at the various scales that we're going to be looking at it at, right? So even if you can't feel like you're doing a really thorough or really accurate analysis at this particular scale, I think you'll find as we get into the other scales, it might be easier to address some specificity of education versus living, and then understanding this building in the context of the larger Minneapolis area and its role in those two phases of education and housing now, right? So okay.
And I can tell at least some about the structure from the drawings that I have access to. It's definite. It was originally all load-bearing walls, or almost all load-bearing walls, from what I can tell. Especially since the walls are pretty much just copied through the whole floor plan, with some being subtracted as you go up. But the infill walls for the apartment renovation were clearly like light wood frame with just gypsum board. The floor plates seem to be fairly thick wood framing, the roof also wood framing. The foundation is where it gets kind of interesting. It looks like it's concrete poured foundation with an overturned slab that goes several feet into the ground because of the frost line in Minneapolis, which probably also adds a lot to energy because it's a fairly large footprint.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's what's good is even those drawings, even though they don't have it's hard to get maybe a lot of accurate detail. I think like you've done enough of saying, all right, you can see these big kind of spread bell caisson, or big spread footings underneath the walls right. And you can kind of at least get a rough kind of takeoff of, the quantities of materials. And like you said, make some assumptions about the makeup of the wall, just in terms of, it's solid masonry. It's not a masonry veneer cavity like we would see, like one would build, nowadays, right? It's truly solid masonry, like you said, with wood, with timber, beams and joists and roofing and all that, right? And then and then I think the important thing is, I think for you is going to be to differentiate between it as a shelter in its role as school, and then how that has changed in its role as housing, right? And so that's the sort of trigger, right? That's right. Those are the two temporal scales that one would address with this. So, okay, cool. But I think it's neat. I think it's neat that it's changed, and that you just
I thought that was cool.
Found that out. So, great. All right, who wants to?
Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
Sure.
Stephen, great.
I can share mine.
So, sounds good.
I have them on my other, so I can't share my screen, but I'll.
Okay. Do you want me to?
Follow me.
Yeah.
You could share your screen too, so it's.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
It's up there.
Okay. Everybody see that?
My
All right. Where are you?
Oh, also, my Zoom keeps telling me my connection is unstable. So if I break up or
you can turn your video off if you want.
Need to repeat something, let me know.
Yeah, why don't you turn your video off just to help save bandwidth, and there we go.
So this is the Buttery Mill. Buttery is the name of the person who bought it. It's not doesn't have anything to do with butter. And it is a sawmill. It's not a highly documented building, so there isn't too much in the way of I don't know. It's pretty straightforward and simple. I'm not going to read through this text, obviously, but it just kind of goes through its history. And supposedly, according to this documentation, it is the oldest sawmill in the country. Although it is not the original structure, there was an original that was built like a half mile up the river that it's on and burned down. And so this structure was built in 1759. And it's a pretty simple kind of shed. It's not completely enclosed, so it has openings where I guess I explain it. It has a basement and then a main story and then a loft. And it's all wood as far as I can tell. And basically the timbers are kind of rolled down into, I don't know what you would call it, just a pit where it's kind of the raw timbers. And then this crane picks up the timbers and sets them down inside, where there's a circular saw that, sorry, someone outside my house is yelling. It's distracting. And so this plan here is kind of the main ground floor that kind of illustrates. So here's the crane that kind of pulls and lifts the timbers in, and that's where the timber is sawn. And apparently this mill cut the timbers for a lot of the houses and structures that were in this community back, in the 17 and 1800s. And it's right on the banks of, I think, what's called the Silvermine River. I don't know if this is in Norwalk, Connecticut. And I think it actually used a kind of a water wheel turbine to power the saw and the crane. And I'm really attracted to, you know, the self-sufficient quality of it. And so I use Rhino, and this is obviously very basic for right now. They describe the walls as just vertical siding. And so I just kind of guessed on the dimensions of each one of these, you know, little, the wood siding that makes up the walls.
Yeah.
And they have columns of different sizes, which was kind of annoying to model, that some were 11 by 11 inches, some were 8 by 5 inches, as far as I could tell. And then some, it was too blurry for me to make out, but this was kind of the ground floor layout. And so, yeah, I mean, I obviously want to do more work on this model in the loft and the basement. And then if I can, I'd like to dig into maybe even modeling the water turbine and exploring, you know, more of the self-sufficient quality of, you know, how it gets its energy, because I think that obviously relates a lot to what we're doing in this seminar.
Yeah. No, that's great.
And,
yeah.
Here's some. Yeah.
I mean, I know I was surprised to read that when it said, I mean, and again, you know, what does that exactly mean? The oldest mill, you know, because I'm sure, you know, there were people milling, you know, timbers by hand, you know, before this, right? But maybe, you know, the first maybe well-established, you know, mill using this sort of water-powered system, right? No, I think this is a great start, and I know, again, just like Billy, you made a quick kind of a last-minute change to this building, and I think it's great. I think what it'll be interesting is as a way to compare and contrast milling practices throughout time, right? When we compare it to Isaias's and Brennan's projects with two other sort of timber mills, and in two very different locations around the country, right? So I think it in my mind, at least, it starts to bring to light some very interesting ways that we can start to compare these things through both space and time to one another, right? And yeah, I mean, as you said, it's a big dumb shed, right? But that's okay, because again, I think as we start to look at the different scales, you know, the complexity is perhaps not in the material makeup, but in the sort of the way this thing contributes to the larger system, right? So, but I think this is a good start. And again, like, you know, the assumptions you're making about the siding, right? I mean, yeah, you might not know the exact width of those boards, but you can figure out a rough kind of idea of volume of that material just based on this, you know, the amount of surface area that's there, right? And a kind of rough guess at how thick you think that those boards might be, right? And again, I think that's the best you can do, right? I mean, your drawings are a bit more sparse than a lot of other people's, but I think, and yes, and like you said, you have to maybe use some investigation to just, or some relative scaling to get a sense of how big some of these elements are relative to each other. But I think that's, in my mind, or at least for me, that's part of the fun too of digging into these old buildings, is just sort of the investigation and understanding of how a building was built at that time, right? And with what was made, with what was available at that time, right? And so, yeah, hopefully I think you're heading down a good path, and I think you've gotten to a good place considering the fact that you made that last minute change. So hopefully you feel that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely looking for a building that you know, is simple in its materiality and geometry, but also, you know, structurally well put together. I mean, obviously I need to, once I finish modeling like where the loft goes and where the basement go, then I obviously want to get into like the rafters and you know, more of the structural system and get into finer details.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is kind of what I was looking for.
Good.
Something that was a little simpler so that I could get a little bit more in.
Yeah. Yes. Physically simple, I would argue probably energetically complex, right? So, okay, good. So it's about 8 after, yeah, so are there questions, or I guess, Stephen, are you concerned or question about where you're gonna go with the next scale? I think similar to some of the other folks we've talked to about mills, I think it's pretty clear that you can drill down into the, you know, activity of the milling process itself as a sort of study of this building a setting, right? And then zoom out as building a site, think about it in its large. And what I like is that again, even though there's several of you who are doing mills, that there's quite a bit of variety in terms of location and time with which those mills operated that would lend themselves to very interesting studies on a larger scale of site. So you're feeling pretty good about where you can take that?
Yeah, I think so. I just need to dive in more. I mean, you know, as you know, it took me a little while to settle on this building, but now that
Okay. Good. All right. So who hasn't gone yet? Yvonne, right? Kyla.
I can go next if.
I was just going to do a quick poll if anybody wanted to take a quick, maybe 5-minute break and then come back. Would that be good? So we've been let's do a quick 7-minute break, and we'll reconvene back at 11:15. Okay. 11:15, and we'll get back going with Yvonne, and then I think the last couple of people to show, and then we'll have a brief discussion about where to go to next. Okay. All right. So 11:15, back at it. Thanks, guys. People, and then we'll talk about next steps. Wait a minute, I'm very confused. You guys, Kyle and Isaiah are roommates, I take it.
Who's Kyle?
You should just switch buildings halfway through the case study. That'll make it interesting. All right, so I think Yvonne was going to go next, and then I think Eugene and Joe Shaner and Kyla are the last people that haven't gone. So we can kind of.
Hey, sorry about that.
No, that's right. No worries. No worries. So I think you had kind of agreed to go next. So why don't you share your screen and take control, and then we'll go from there.
All right. You guys see?
Yep.
So the building I selected, or the area I selected, is the Central Aguirre. It's a sugar mill, and it has a deep historical meaning in the island of Puerto Rico. It was one of the biggest sugar mills with the biggest production in the island. And I think it's the only one in the historic buildings. And it's also, this is the old sugar mill, and this is now a power station. And it's one of the main power stations of the island. So that's a neat relationship there. One of the interesting things about this is kind of the growth based on the history of the island and the politics and the region and all that stuff, and sugar itself and the exports of sugar. So it started back in like under Spanish colony and then transitioned to American owners, and it started developing. And then right around 1950s, they changed from like bagged sugar to bulk sugar. So it also like expanded it. So they had this whole like town. It was a company town based on this sugar mill and this production. These are just like the departments that were located in here. And then this main complex here is what I'm interested in exploring, especially one of the warehouses in here. Most of the processes are done here, and then these are all like warehouses for sugar, and they have lumbers and all that stuff here, but I won't go into that. And it's kind of destroyed now. It's in ruins. There's a couple of things standing still, but it's mostly kind of destroyed. But there's a couple of documents about it. These are just diagrams. But yeah, I found like a couple of verbal descriptions and these plans that were made by somebody that really went into them and mapped them out. But I don't have precise plans or elevations or sections, but I am in contact with somebody from like the University of Puerto Rico in the architecture department, and I think there's some drawings over there. I'm not sure if they can send it over digitally or how, but I'm still trying to figure that out. Hopefully I'll get something. But yeah, that's mainly, this is all the production here, and these are the warehouses, and these are like the boiler room over here. And this the warehouse 1 and 2 are the main warehouses that were built. This one was built like in early 1900s, but was destroyed and then built again 1950s with this one too. And it was built out of concrete. So it's concrete and steel with corrugated steel on the outside. So it's a pretty cool mix of materials. And all these things here might be interesting to explore. And this is the current state of it. It's partially destroyed. There was a fire in 2000 that destroyed most of it. So there's pictures of before and after, which is kind of cool. And as you can see, it's mostly concrete, and there's some steel, and there's these like items here that are still in there. These are some just descriptions that I found. I think it's
great. Great. So yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, these are just pictures like before the fire, after the fire, just interior. You can see, and then I just started modeling it out.
Oh, great. Okay, cool.
But hopefully, if I get the better floor plans and sections and all that stuff, I can get better.
Yeah, but it looks like you're making pretty good assumptions with what you have, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm mostly assuming the thicknesses and of the beams and the columns and the walls and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's pretty standard building, so I don't think there's too much science to it.
Okay. Yeah, great. Oh, that looks great. Well, and I think again, it seems like another example where, while this particular building itself may seem pretty banal and mundane, right? There's a lot more interesting things to think about or to talk about when you zoom in and then zoom out. So yeah, I think it's great. So, and hopefully, yeah, if you can get that additional information, I think that's just going to be icing on the cake and probably help.
That'd be great.
Help make your job easier. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Great. All right. Any other questions or concerns that you have, Ivan? Or are you?
I'm mostly interested in that, asking about. There's a part about maintenance and like systems and all that stuff that's due for next week that we're supposed to look into it, and I'm not sure how much I can get on system for maintenance on this type of buildings, since it's just a warehouse.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll we'll talk a little bit about that at the end and about where to go. And I think the reading for this week will sort of clarify some of that in terms of what, and again, it's about making assumptions. I mean, clearly it's fallen into disrepair. And so in a way it's, the maintenance is
there's not much left.
Yeah, exactly. It's deferred maintenance that clearly has caused it to demise. So, but again, I think that's okay, right? You can still look at the temporal time frame of how long that thing persisted in that state, right? Because that's what we're talking about here, right? Is building a shelter for a certain duration, and some of the buildings are still operating, some of them are not, perhaps, right? So,
all right.
Okay. All right.
All right.
All right, Joe, Shaner, Kyla, or Eugene, who wants to go next?
I'll do it. I'm good.
Oh.
Eugene? Okay, how about Eugene?
Yeah.
And then Joe, and then Kyla. And then is that everybody? I don't think that's everybody, I think, right? Okay, all right, that's the order we'll go in. Okay.
Wait, so my building was like the Spanish ballroom, and I show like two pictures of them just to show the materials. And I think one of the most interesting thing of my building was like it have like two different kind of structures. Like for the main ballroom, for the dancing room, it has like a wooden floor system and concrete walls. But for the lobbies around, they have like wood wall system with a stucco as a exterior finish, and have like, I think it should be something like a concrete floor or a wood floor, but have a steel columns just directly to the concrete slabs. So here are the plans I use for my model. So here are the main room that's made by, it has like thick concrete wall and a wood, a wood floor. And the surround lobbies are made by just have a wood wall system. And I just start with my floor and the wall system, and I try to use like two kind of different materials to like just clarify them. Yeah.
Okay.
And I put this section here because I wanted to show like the basement of this building. Like they also have two kind of basements, because for the ballroom, for the dancing room here, they have the traditional, like I think it's traditional concrete basement, but for the lobbies around, they have like steel columns and directly to the slab like that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because so again, and you should rely heavily on that written description that really talks about the material makeup of the walls, the floors, the steel trusses, right? So Eugene came to my office hours on Wednesday, and I kind of helped her dig out, and because the drawings themselves were not very detailed, but when you read the description and you kind of couple that with the drawings, you can you can learn a lot about the building that way. So just remember not to get too bogged down with, again, try to really marry together those two bits of information, the sort of graphics that you have with the sort of written descriptions, because I think that's going to really clarify the material makeup. They do a great job of talking about, the steel trusses that make up the roof, and that they're sitting on steel columns that are sort of those are the ones that are then going down to those piers that you're showing, right? Because I think those are on what I think, if I read it correctly, it's like 15'6" centers, right? There's 7-foot tall steel trusses or something like that. So, you know, that all of that information will go a long way to help you really sort of piece together the material makeup of this building, right? Okay. And I know, so does that seem reasonable?
Yeah,
Mhm.
and yeah, and I found it interesting that like this building do not have an insulation, because I think the designers wanted to like just for the for the functions, for the main function of the building, like it's only used during the summer when they first built, and they didn't add an insulation for it. So I think it's kind of interesting when I just summarize the energy for that, like
Well, I think
yeah.
I remember reading, I think that originally it was built, those upper windows were actually not windows, they were just open air, right? Like I think it really truly was meant like as a big open air
Yeah.
dance hall pavilion, right? Like you said. And so you should also contextualize this for everybody else who doesn't know the project. It's part of a much larger sort of amusement. I don't know what you would call it. Yeah, like an amusement. It's this park essentially, I think, right? Glen Echo Park or something like that, right? That's has like a carnival grounds, and it's in Maryland, just outside DC. And so you know, this is just one sort of building as part of a larger complex, is similar to what a lot of people are dealing with, and understanding how this fits into how this, you know, serves as the ballroom and fits into the larger other aspects of the site will be helpful when we zoom out. And then when we zoom in and think about, you know, why you picked the building, which I think from our discussions have been about your interest in it as a cultural sort of icon in terms of the activity that happened within this space, right? So again, I think you know, right now, just dig into the material makeup of everything. You know, I think you're doing a good job with what you have, but I just, you know, really kind of try to understand it and take it apart from that perspective for this sort of first stage of the analysis. So I think you have a lot of information there. I think you just gotta process through it a little bit more, Stu. Partly because your building is a bit more complex and big compared to a lot of these other ones as well, right? Where these nice simple dumb sheds are pretty easy to model pretty quickly, whereas this, you have a lot of intricate detail and ornamentation, partly because of the nature of the building, right? And in a way, I think this is a good segue into Joe's project, because we have similar functions in a way. I mean, you know, these big, large open spaces for gathering and activity, right? You know, which again, I would, in my mind, there's not much difference between that and a big industrial shed as well, though. I mean, I think they're all operating in a very, I mean, I can break your building down to a single bay of 15'6" center to center spacing of these, you know, steel columns and roof trusses. And in my mind, you could model that in a way that it's no different than one of these big industrial sheds that somebody's doing, right? It's just big spaces, right? With some little spaces and medium spaces and little spaces surrounding it. So, okay, so don't lose sight of that, and they'd say don't get bogged down in the minutia. I mean, even though I'm asking you to kind of think about the minutia, but don't get bogged down in being too hung up on it. Just make sure you are always kind of thinking about the relative scale of these things. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Joe, you want to take control?
Sure. So I'm relatively new to Miro, so I don't really know how this works.
You and me both, brother.
All right, great. Fantastic. Okay. All right. That everybody seeing that?
Yep.
Great. Oh. See. Even just like where the shit is my board? Found it. All right, great, fantastic. And what I click.
You can say bring
live.
everyone to me. Yeah, there we go.
Great. All right, so I'm looking at the meeting house of the Lebanon Shakers. It has some really good documentation, as a lot of Shaker buildings do, and sort of the fun or great thing about doing a project based on the Shakers is that they had a bunch of different villages kind of scattered around the eastern seaboard, and they used, I think basically each kind of community took the construction methods from the previous one and replicated them. And so a lot of the facilities are similar. And so if you can't kind of figure out one thing based on the actual building that I'm looking at, I've found a bunch of resources and books. The Kentucky Shakers in particular have a pretty rich amount of information about how they built things in the community in general. So just, looking at, the exterior of it, the meeting spaces of it. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is I think there's a lot that all of us could learn from their actual methods of construction. I think they were really intentional and also very simple. And also, I don't think I'm ever going to do a barrel vault. I think they look stupid. So I wanted to take a chance to explore it and see how it works structurally. So yeah, again, great documentation, and even down to the details of it, there's a lot of information. Okay. And then for those who haven't looked at a lot of Shaker buildings, I thought I would just post a few pictures of them because
That's beautiful.
yeah, they're amazing. They're just incredibly detail oriented, and they did a lot with light, and they did a lot with simple colors, either natural wood or some basic stains, and then yellow, white, and blue tend to be the colors that are seen in their buildings.
Well, and I have to say, you poo-poo the barrel vault, but look at the way the light bounces around in that vaulted space.
No, it's incredible. I mean, it's not a bad form. It's just the
No, I don't know. I'm just giving you a hard time.
Yeah. Anyway, but also
the material is great, and the way the control of light, right? With those shutters, right?
That's another thing, and that I think doing a building, it's not small, but it's not huge, and so I think that gives me a chance to dig into a few details in some key places. And they did, these sort of Dutch shutters, which kind of break out and open in different ways to allow different amounts of light. And they had a lot of exterior shutters too that control the light. And then, there are just also some very fun drawings. So this is a map of the actual village. And sorry, I'm fighting a cold. This is a map of the actual village. I'm looking at the second family meeting house, which is over yonder somewhere. I can't exactly remember, and I had to kind of reduce the quality of this. But I mean, it's a good opportunity to, thinking about larger systems and how the community works as a whole, to sort of think about how this group of people organize themselves and why.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a fun map. This is really informative, but it was plow the fields to sow the seeds, to raise the wheat, to feed the cows, churn the milk, to make the butter, to make the bread, to sell the bread, to buy the seed, to plow the fields. So really useful map I made for you guys to understand how that community worked.
That's great.
Yeah. And then, I have a 3D model of it going. Do you still see that, or did I?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there it is.
Cool.
I mean, I'm working on sort of figuring out the truss systems in the barrel vault and the different floors. But again, I have plenty of information, so that doesn't seem to be an issue.
Good. That's great. Awesome. And I think it sounds like you have an idea of where you're going with moving forward into the smaller scale and then perhaps back out into the larger.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Okay. Any concerns or questions or?
Not really. I mean, yeah, not really. I think I need to do some more research in terms of exactly where the material came from.
Yeah, and I think, again, some of that is going to be, I think, getting to your initial question in the morning, right, is how detailed can you go? Well, I think as detailed as you can get, right? And then I think, yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. But let's have Kyla go, and then we'll try to close with some brief kind of next steps discussion. Okay.
Okay. All right, I'll share my screen and then I'll have to orient myself. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of you.
No worries.
All your faces. Mira's been really clumsy for me, so we'll see how well this works. Okay, so I switched my building last weekend and landed on the Connellsville Coal and Coke region of southwestern Pennsylvania, which is an area that's like, it's like a 40-mile swath. So I kind of narrowed down to Shoaf Coal Works, which is right here in Fayette County, because it had the best documentation out of all of the facilities within the region, I felt. So the building that I am kind of focusing in on is the Tipple. So it's right here. I'll draw a circle around it. That is the structure that's used to load the extracted product for transport into the railroad cars. Oops. Okay.
I know. I
didn't. Yeah. I haven't been able to get a good look at actual scaled drawings of the building itself. I've just got this site section that's pretty general, and then I've got a site plan where you can just see the little roof plan over there. So I'll have to do a lot of inference myself, but yeah, here's the site plan, and Tipple is right next to this long row of block ovens, and then there's the rail yard, and kind of like drives in and out of that structure. I've got a few images of the building today. It's pretty well documented, at least as far as amateur photography goes, just like people in the region whose, forefathers worked there and they have, some sentimental stake in it. So next, we've got a couple of different views and just moving things around. Yeah, so there's some other views of this Tipple. I didn't include all the photos that I found. I found quite a few. It's still a little, there's the railroad line. It's got this nice bridge that I thought Mark would appreciate. And then here is an old photo of the line of brick ovens. I had better luck finding new photos of the historical site than historic photos. But there were a lot of photos of the region in general, but like of honing in on the Shoaf building specifically, it was a bit trickier.
Yeah.
But there were these really great drawings. sort of looking at the different types of oven and the different types of operation. So this is sort of a diagram of the hand drawing operation versus the machine operated operation, the machine operated process. And you can see there, that's like loading in the hopper car of the railroad. And then there's like a top-down view of it. And then here are some more detailed images of the ovens themselves. You've got a beehive, which is sort of zoom in from these over here. And then we've got a rectangular, and then we've got a block oven, which actually I think the block is what the first image up here is looking at. But yeah, then got a nice little partial elevation of the ovens themselves. So there's a lot going on inside of, this long line of ovens that isn't immediately apparent on the outside.
You have a lot of pretty thorough written documentation. Did you find, have you had a chance to look at that in terms of the building you want to focus on in terms of, is there maybe written description, even if there's lacking of necessarily of the drawing documentation?
I've been looking into that.
Okay.
It's close to 200 pages.
Yeah, I remember it was a big document. Yeah.
I did find this was an estimate of like the material that ran through the facility.
That's great.
And so like I know that the building is primarily like lumber, brick, and like light steel on the outside. But what I found pretty interesting was sort of in a very similar manner, there was a lot of documentation about the nationalities and ethnicities of the workers of the facility. And this is like a government document. And it pretty much like condones discrimination. So I found that pretty interesting. Like it's talking about the evil effects of the importation of Italians, pauper labor, quote unquote, and the worst class of citizen being Hungarians, Serbs, Croatians, immigrants from Eastern Europe.
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like yours is going to. I mean, you may be maybe a little sparse on information related to this phase where you're looking at the building as shelter, right? I'd say try to do the best you can with the inference, but I think as we've talked about, I think when we were looking at this building, it's going to be chocked full, probably almost too much information, even when you zoom into, let's say, setting of, is this thing operating as a, coal industry, right? And then zooming or, housing the activity that it's doing, and then zooming out and saying its role in the larger world system of, right, from both human exploitation for people doing the work here, but also just the impact that this thing has had on the modern kind of, where we are in terms of the world industrial system, right? I think, I think it's an interesting project from that regard. Even if you have a hard time maybe I would say try to do the best you can with, like you said, making some general educated guesses and inferences as best you can. But clearly you have a lot of information at those other scales. So
totally. Okay. I just thought it was interesting, like considering human capital sort of through the same lens as material, and thought that would like fold in well to wanting to shift the focus to re-educating workers of outdated fields. Industries. Thanks.
No, that's great. Good. So you feeling okay about this choice?
Yeah, I think it's interesting and I like it.
Good, good. Okay, so we're a couple minutes past time. I just want to briefly kind of point you to, I'm just going to share my screen really quick before I lose you all. Where we're at in terms of this week. I made sure that the Zoom, I'm in student view, so I made sure that the Canvas stuff is all available now. There is the reading is fairly, is much more explicitly on the Emergy analysis methodology in much more detail. So it's basically the jumping off point is you have your building and you've kind of understand its material makeup the best you can. Now, what do you start to do with that? And here's where it also gets into a little bit more in depth about the ways that you can start to diagram out these system models. So here's where you're taking basically the model that you're forming, from a digital model, and you're actually starting to model it through this sort of mapping of these flows. Okay. And again, it can be fairly fine grained and be fairly aggregated as well. Okay. And then it's like, so what, right? What do you do with that? So it starts to then also talk about basically the evaluation table that one would put together as a result of that, with those quantifications, right? And the transformatives. So what I would like you all to sort of work on towards next week is to kind of go through these, go through this chapter. I've also included at the end of it, it gives you like a little exercise of a small building to test out the methodology a little bit, where it actually gives you the quantities of the materials. And I've also included an additional reading that gives you more information associated. So here, the appendix has all the transformity tables that you would need to do the Emergy analysis itself. And then this is actually the building that the chapter uses as a test. This is a little bit of a case written chapter that goes more in depth about it and how it could be used to compare how it could be used to start to do this exact exercise right here. So I think here's the diagram that I think starts to become most useful, where it's really looking at the material makeup of all of the different elements that make up this admittedly small, simple structure, and then what you could start to do with it. So here he's actually quantifying the carbon sequestration, right? But it's the same quantities of materials that you could start to use to do the Emergy transformation. And I actually will probably post another reading that you could do. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to compare the value of doing this very sort of monolithic, solid all wood construction versus what we would typically do for a building, which is a multi-layered, what you're learning to do in enclosures probably right now, which is a multi-layered rain screen system with, lots of different layers that we know very little about, right? And so, but I think it's just a useful exercise, and he starts to map the material geographies of if you do the stack approach versus the stick approach, and then how the building actually performs from a thermal performative standpoint. So there's a lot of lessons to learn from this very little case study, and then and hopefully how we begin to apply it maybe to the Emergy methodology. So have a look at these documents. I think what I would really like you guys to do is don't treat next Friday as treat it as like a in progress deadline as well, in terms of doing the best you can to do your sort of model and documentation of gathering materials, and then doing your best attempt at a systems diagram and Emergy sort of evaluation table with as much as you have. Okay, so. And then I think that will give me, going through this, and then what I plan to do on Friday is, I think you'll post that and submit that as on Canvas. But just remember, it's a work in progress, and we're going to keep developing and refining these projects as we look into the different scales. It's just a way to kind of try to get you, keep you on track so that, again, you don't get lost in the minutia. And then hopefully we'll have discussion and a little bit of conversation related to these readings for this week and going more in depth to the Amergy methodology, because I think we're all going to need more time to kind of sort through that and how that actually, the logistics of that and what one really does with it. And I want to actually spend the time really talking about it so that you don't get lost in sort of in the weeds, right? So but do your best you can for next week to try to document as much of that stuff as possible and take your stab at it. And then hopefully the discussion next week will provide additional insights into where you can kind of continue to go with it, especially as we drill down into a different scale of analysis. Are there any questions? So I tried to give less required. I mean, there's, yeah, I don't know. I tried. How are you guys feeling in terms of workload? Does that seem sort of reasonable to say, it's this phase is pretty critical where we're looking at the building as sort of this shelter, and I don't want to kind of just blow through it. If you guys are struggling with maybe getting some of the documentation and all of that done. I know this takes time, especially digging into and understanding the existing building. It takes time. So I want you guys to really sort of spend the time to do it well so that you can start to see the applicability of what it is we're doing. Does that seem good? Seem reasonable? And I did include a video here. I have the second Jeannie Gang lecture in that series of videos that I posted from the last one as an optional one if you want to watch it. They're a really great series of 3 lectures she gave at the University of Chicago. I also have a little video that you could watch that has this guy that's interpreted Odom's, this sort of energy systems language, and has created some very cool little animated videos that show how it could be applied at different scales. So you could have a look at that as well. But I think the reading in general will start to hopefully clarify the methodology a bit more. And I think it's going to take some time really digging into that to then say, how do we apply this at the different scales that we're talking about. So I just want to make sure we're not, plus I know you're all probably pretty saturated with your other classes. So does that seem reasonable if you can kind of just, give it the old college try and see where you get to? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any kind of concerns or questions that anybody might have for the group? Otherwise, again, if you come, feel free to drop into my office hours. Those are good times to try to work through some maybe more specific questions you might have related to your project, or if I can help try to do some detective work to figure some things out. When Eugene came to my office hours on Wednesday, it really, I think, helped clarify specifically her makeup of her building and what she could sort of focus on. So, but again, I know that there is a steep learning curve with this stuff, and I get it. And and it seems like you guys are starting to make the connections, and I appreciate that, basically, especially with your reading responses. I think it's really helpful to hear what things are resonating with you and what things maybe are still a little confusing. It helps me understand how to spend the time. So, and I think this was helpful to kind of see what everybody's working on and the different scope and scale that they're focusing on. But use the readings this week to maybe help you more clearly define, and you literally will have to do that, where you have to say, this is my system boundary, right? That's the first step of this methodology. And I think you've all pretty much said it, but now it's kind of really sort of in a way showing it. So, okay. So I'm happy to, I'll let you guys go since I've held you long anyway, but I'm happy to hang back for a few more minutes if anybody wants to talk individually in the meantime. Otherwise, I will happy to meet with you guys next week during office hours, or, and again, we'll hopefully have a fruitful discussion in the more general. What I'll probably do is I'll probably show that stack house description and maybe use that as a vehicle to have a more detailed discussion on, which is what I had planned to do today, actually. But I think it was worth spending the time going deeply into each of your own individual projects and see what you're working on. But again, you know, this case study really is a good example of how one could start to apply this methodology, understand, you know, the difference in terms of these different, you know, the material makeup of these different systems and then how they contribute to the overall, even for a very simple building, right? So some of you who maybe have very simple industrial buildings, you know, there's still a lot of complexity there with when we think about it at this scale. So, and then I think also too, there'll be some time just understanding this language that Odin has put together, which is this energy systems language. And I really want you guys to spend some time digging into that. I really appreciate the diagrams that some of you have already been putting together in Kumu. And this is just essentially an extension of that, a next step of that, where you start to get more specific about what some of these, you know, circles represent. And they, you know, using this sort of symbology of things that are sources, things that are meant to be, you know, a production component, things that are meant to be consumers, things that are meant to be storage, what we would think of as sort of stocks, and a building is a stock of materials, right? And that's sort of what you're kind of quantifying kind of right now, right? And, you know, you'll see in the diagram, and some of you have seen this even in Bill Braham's diagrams, you know, how you can start to map all these flows and, you know, think of, and the exercise is, again, just another form of modeling where you're really starting to think about what are all the inputs and outputs in this system. And in order to do that, you have to draw a box around the system, right? It's just like we talked about with our lawn analogy or our forest analogy or whatever, right? You have to sort of say, what is the container I'm looking at? And in this case, it's very explicitly usually a building, right? And I think that's good in a way because it's easy to quantify that. It's going to become a little bit trickier when we go down to the next scale when we talk about building a setting for work and you know, work and living. Perhaps some of you, I think it's going to actually be much clearer when you do that. And then for some of you, it's going to be more clear when we zoom out and think of building as site and its impact on its larger sort of place and context in the world system. So, so again, have a look at the reading. We'll plan on give it the best bet. We'll continue to try to, you know, have something posted to Canvas though for this to satisfy this sort of in progress deadline. And then we'll start talking more deeply about it, have some discussion, and then think about where we'll go from the next scale moving in. Okay. All right. Anybody got any burning questions?
Mark, I might stay on to ask you a couple questions.
That's fine. That's great. Yeah. Otherwise, have a good weekend, y'all, and I'll look for my emails on Monday. I'll try to clarify some of this since I didn't get to spend maybe as much time talking about it. So, but in the meantime, just start digging into the reading, and hopefully that'll start to clear some things up. Okay.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, guys. I really like where all your buildings are going. It's fun looking at all these old buildings. I like the one you settled on, Billy.
Yeah, me too. I'm pretty excited about it. I think that, I don't know, I like the fact that it's just so well documented.
That helps. And as I think as we've seen, that makes a big difference, right? Because again, I think as you start to dig in the energy methodology, you're going to find that it's pretty complicated to begin with, right? And just trying to grasp your head around, you know, a well-documented building that you can know a lot about from a material standpoint is having that as a jumping off point makes things a lot easier. So,
right.
Well, hopefully make things a lot easier. So,
Yeah. So I had a question about the spreadsheet, and I'm wondering if you knew if like you can export from Revit like a spreadsheet of all the materials used. Is that possible?
Yes, there are. Yeah, there's ways. You generate schedules from your
Oh, right.
from your Revit file. Yeah. So what I don't use Revit pretty much. I don't use Revit very much myself anymore. It's been a decade since I really used it on a regular basis. But I know that that's one of its powers, right? It's because I mean it's a database, right? It's a visual database, quite frankly. And so all the data is there. If you're modeling these walls and you're assigning them to families and you're labeling what those families are, you have all the data there, right? That's partly where using a tool like Revit makes your life a lot easier, because you can just quickly export that, get your quantities, do your material takeoff, and then start to do the more detailed analysis. While it may feel like a lot more legwork in the front end, I think the payoff becomes evident when you on the back end when you have the data at your disposal, right? So I can't walk you through necessarily the logistics of doing that, but it's there, right? And then even with, I don't know if you've played around with Dynamo at all, which is that's the parametric plugin for Revit that's similar, that's kind of modeled after Grasshopper, right? And that I've played around with that actually more recently than I have with just Revit in general, but that becomes a way that you could actually start to filter that information as well from Revit and into Excel spreadsheets and do some of these calculations and things. So you might find, and I don't know how Tally does it, but I bet Tally is doing the exact same thing where it's drawing on that data that exists in the model to do these.
Yeah, the Tally output is a spreadsheet.
Yeah, right. So there you go, right? I mean, that's all we're doing is pushing data around, right? We're data analysts.
So as far as my building in particular, were you thinking that I should try to catalog all those materials on the roof that were probably like,
I think that's going to be tricky. I think if, as best you can. I mean, I think it would be really interesting, and it might be hard for this at this stage to do that. I think it becomes a really interesting question maybe as you drill down into the next scale. And so maybe even if you can't necessarily, if all you can do for next week is to really get the skin and bones of the warehouse proper without that sort of superficial layer, which is significant. I don't mean to downplay it. It's hugely significant, especially when if you were to look at it from a material standpoint. They're building like a whole fake, it's a whole Hollywood set right on top of this huge warehouse. So I think it's worth trying to maybe, as best you can, start to do, but I would say it may be more applicable when we get into thinking about it as building as setting, right? Where you can sort of talk about why was it camouflaged? What were, that's all pretty self-evident, right? In terms of I think
the site would be, would it be like how the building is like submerged in the water on one side, and like the fact that they had to remediate the pollutants after it was demolished?
Well, I think you could think about it that way, but I think it's even bigger than that. I mean, I think it's building its impact and significance in the larger. I mean, in the war production, the larger. You know what I'm saying, right? Like Boeing's role in World War II, right? I mean, it's so you could. We can talk more maybe specifically about that but don't constrain it to what we typically think of as site, right? Which is the physical property boundary. I think you're going to want to think about it in terms of even beyond that, in terms of, its role and Boeing's continued role in you know, how much energy and
Right.
material goes into the production of these war machines to this day, right? And like, you know, that's significant, and especially on the world system of understanding, right? Like, you know, I don't know, but Bucky Fuller had and it's probably a reading I'll give to you guys in the winter, but he had this great essay on he called it From Weaponry to Livingry. And it's basically, he argues, right, if we and maybe I'll post it to Canvas for those as an optional reading if anybody's interested, but
yeah, that'd be cool.
Especially because it's pretty applicable to your project, and it's actually applicable to the larger studio in general. And I give it as a reading related to this design studio, but it's, you know, when you think about if we were to put the resources and energy that we currently set towards things related to destroying each other as a civilization, towards actually taking care of one another and toward, you know, really putting those resources to building things for living rather than killing, just how different the world would look, right? And how different we would all operate and function, right? And so it lends itself to an interesting understanding of, well, how did that plant contribute to, how did the material flows in and out of that, right, contribute to the larger effort of World War II and up to the continued sort of propagation of this sort of military industrial complex that is a tremendous drain on our civilization, right? I mean, and I would argue all civilizations over time, right? If you look at most sort of major civilizations, they all went through a period of tremendous consumption related to defense and a conquest and empire building, essentially, right? And for us, for the United States, it was end of World War II to, you know, now, basically, right? It was when, you know, so I think there's really interesting stories that you could probably frame your project in that, a larger discussion around that at the scale of, let's say, site, right? Or building a site in terms of its contribution to those things. But I think that's for maybe a deeper discussion later on. But I just want to plant those seeds in your mind to start to think about what other information you might start to gather to help you do that, right? But I think in the meantime, I think you're doing the right thing, focusing on, you know, the warehouse or the production building and thinking about the layers around that, right? Like you're saying, right? So, yeah, does that help?
Closure layers, or
yeah, exactly, yeah, and just what that thing is just a building, right? Like before it could be anything else, it has to be that, right? So
yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I'll probably see you later this week.
Sounds good.
All right.
All right. Adria or Brennan, what are you at?
I was going to ask if how much you knew about Revit.
I'm pretty rusty. I tend to gravitate towards Rhino myself these days.
Yeah, I know. And I could do this all super fast in Rhino, but I wanted to dive into Revit for this course just for, you know, having access to Tally and all that.
Yeah, and I encourage you. I mean, I would say do it. You know, because again, especially if you're comfortable in another tool and you've always got that in your back pocket to fall back onto. I mean, the other thing to think is to look into is there's been a lot of really great integration with Rhino and Revit, right? In terms of modeling things in Rhino that you can drive into Revit and still get the intelligence and sophistication of. So there's people who've been doing, I think it's more with the work in progress version of Rhino 7 that has the Rhino Inside feature where you can basically model you can use Grasshopper to basically drive stuff really easily into Revit, easily from Rhino. Yeah. So I don't want to send you down a rabbit hole but I would say if you're a kind of really comfortable Rhino user, you might look into what those options are, because I personally, the reason I don't like Revit is for me, it's just too clunky of an environment to model in. Like I need a little bit more fluid. I like a more fluid.
Yeah. Exactly.
I was raised on good old 3D AutoCAD and like really modeling and really crude extruded solids and right like that, so for me, when Revit was a bit of I felt like Revit was Autodesk going backwards a little way. I mean, I understand what they were trying to do, but I think there's other tools that I feel like are more, I for what it is, Revit's really powerful. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to and I think for job prospects and all of that, the more facile you are in Revit, the better it's going to serve you. And the more facile you are I'd say in both those worlds, even better, right? So I encourage you to use this as an opportunity to play around.
Okay.
But I can't help you too much with the sort of
no worries.
The nuts and bolts.
Okay.
But I'm happy to try to.
Yeah, I might just kind of stick this out. I mean, like I said, I know I could have all these buildings built really quick. And I really want to take this as an opportunity because I want to, I think, do the terminal project in Revit as well. Mainly to have those tally plugins and.
Well, right. That's the real value of it, right? Is the data that you can start to then extract and use from Revit, right? I mean, that's its power. That's its power, right? Yeah. And even the documentation stuff, right? I mean, even like just the drawings you can start to develop from that model, right? I mean, and I don't know if you've played with Visual Arc at all. It's a plugin.
I think I downloaded it once.
Yeah.
I was going to dive into it, but didn't.
Yeah. I mean, and so it's, but again, it's a bit of a niche and it's, it's not going to give you as universal application as say really understand.
Parametric plugin that's not Grasshopper, right?
Yeah, it's the BIM. It's a kind of a BIM plugin for Rhino. And what I like about it is there is a Grasshopper integration. And I started playing with it this past summer, and admittedly haven't gone as deeply into it as I would have liked to. But But anyway, I think I encourage you, run with the Revit and again, if you get to a point where maybe you do the one building in Revit and then you step back and you do the other things that you can model much more quickly in Rhino, and it's a kind of a mishmash, that's okay, right? I mean, I think there's something to be said about thinking about how all these tools blend together, right?
Right. Okay, cool. All right, thanks.
All right, good luck. Thanks. All right, Adrian, how you doing?
Hey. I'm doing okay. I tend to keep my camera off because sometimes my internet connection almost cuts out.
No worries. So are you feeling a little?
The building I'm living in is just really old. It has a phone line instead of an Ethernet, and even that's in the kitchen.
Are you feeling a little better after the discussion today?
Yeah. There are some things I'm still nervous about, mainly just getting anything close to a modern plan.
Yeah.
I could definitely model something like the building.
Well, and so there's something to be said that I think you'll see this when you do the reading for this week, right? But there's something to be said about you could make the argument that you want to understand this project as school, right? And you're just looking at the 100 years from 1877 to 1977, right? And you can talk about how it's been converted into this new use, but maybe your focus is on how did it operate as a school, right? And that you have plenty of information about, right?
Yeah.
And then if you do find more information in its new form, then you could start to make those comparisons and contrasts, right?
But, you know, the first step would be anyway, all right, what was it for these 100-year period, right? I mean, I think just that is an interesting, so that becomes your boundary of both time and space, right? Is to say,
Yeah.
I'm looking at 100-year period of this building, knowing that it changed after 1977, and that you're going to try to send out feelers and get some more information that will help you maybe understand that. But in the meantime, I want to really deeply understand it in that state of education, which is why I think you picked it initially to begin with, right? Was you wanted to understand it as a school, right?
I did learn a little bit more about what the school stood for. Like initially, it's named after Fredrika Bremer because she was a pro-female education feminist author from Sweden, and Minnesota has a lot of like Scandinavian, Swedish, Norwegian immigrants. So I was thinking about how it's really interesting that this building was constructed seemingly as being mainly a girls' school, but given its time frame, it would have also been a white girls only school. So it's like purposefully including one marginalized group while continuing to excluding another.
Right. Which is the great sort of a great debate within feminism in general, right? Is that it's there's already differentiation between within women as a group already, right? So how do you split those things out? So that's what I'm saying is I think you have a lot to work with just in that right scope. And I think the other stuff is, I think, just gravy, right? Where it could give you more things to talk about and think about in terms of how this building then, like, why did it then, I imagine it was space, right? They probably had to build a bigger school to serve more people, right? But that the building itself, again, as an object, as a store of material, was still of value and to be transformed into this other thing, right? So again, I mean, that could in a way be the end of your story, but it's only the beginning of it in its current form, right? And in its current state. So I still think it's good. And especially I think with this new revelation that it's now actually condos. I think it's actually even more interesting to look at that period, that 100-year period. And the fact that it's so perfectly fit into a 100-year period, I think is it's kind of interesting as well, right? And so that really forces you to say, this is my boundary of time too, right? Which I think is it's a little blurrier for some other of the projects and students where these buildings may be degraded just slowly over time. And where do you put the kind of cutoff for some of that is a little bit more questionable. For you, I think it's really clear. Like it served this role for this period, and now it's something else. And I'm going to just look at it. How did it operate in that 100-year period, right?
And I was kind of wondering at first, like, why there was so much documentation in 1977. But then I realized what happened when I Googled the address and just found a bunch of realty listings. And then I figured out that this is not a school anymore.
Yeah.
And then I realized that was also on Wikipedia. I just didn't look at Wikipedia. I looked at like the historic registry and stuff.
Yeah. Right. And I wonder what happened. I wonder if what happened was they got it registered as a historic place right before the conversion to maybe ensure that the exterior would stay what it was, even if they're going to gut it. And even if they did some work on the inside for upgrading it for condos, you know what I mean? So, no, I think, and plus, go ahead.
This is completely unrelated, but when you referred to your son, did you mean that you have a human child or just a cat child?
Oh, both. Yeah.
Okay. How old is your son?
He's 6. He's 6, eating lunch right now.
I remember being 6.
It's a good age.
Yeah.
And now my furry son is coming to help do some work.
Yeah, my cats, I have my studio stuff in my closet. Basically, my house is broken up into general sleeping space, general living space, but the living space is occupied by the furniture the apartment comes with.
Oh yeah.
The bedroom becomes like office / bedroom / studio space. And then the cats figured out how to open the closet, so they're actually running around in the studio supplies. Like they're wrestling on top of all of like my scales and rulers, just throwing around everything.
What cats will do, right?
Yeah.
And what they're good at.
Yeah.
Oops. Good.
Yeah.
So, but you feel better about
I do feel better. I was nervous last night because I was trying to find an updated plan.
Yeah.
I wasn't planning on just going off of the basic 1909 model. I was like, I should find a modern plan.
Yeah. Well, I think like I said,
At least it's not public.
Right, not readily available. And I think that's even more reason, I think, to constrain your study to these 100 years of what you have the information for. And I think, and do your best to try to send out some feelers to find any additional information as best you can. But I think you've done, a good job of just documenting and assuming what you do know and what you do have available to you. So I think that's all you can do at this point, right? And then I think, and again, it's not that you necessarily want to adjust the project or just the outcome of the project purely based on the limitations of what you have. But I hope you don't think that that's what I'm suggesting you do. But I think it's more that I think there's enough to kind of focus on just in that state that, if you can go deeper. And I think especially with some of the other social and cultural aspects that are embedded in this project that will come to light as you look at it in terms of building a setting for, like you said, education and what this specific school was geared towards, and then zooming out and thinking about it as in its larger context of the Minneapolis area and all of that.
Yeah, and I could certainly look at how its environmental impact has evolved over time, because I noticed there's this central, humongous chimney.
Mm-hmm.
It's just absurdly large. And I can only imagine how much fuel was burned in this
some
building.
giant boiler in the basement.
Yeah.
Right. And then again, how that has maybe, and again, if you can find out more how that has evolved to how that changed in light of its current state, right? Like you said, I think there's probably been this influx in 1977 of all these additional systems to turn it into these little units for living. Whereas when it was a school that was really all towards this one centralized thing for education, right? So.
Yeah, and that one project in Mining the City reminded me a little bit of this building, because they were saying that efficiency wise, it would be best to put the insulation on the outside and reclad the building, but historic preservation prioritize the outside.
Right.
Same thing with this building. All of the insulation was just piled on inside, like a foot.
Right.
An entire foot of rigid insulation.
Right.
But I'm sure there's thermal bridging on every single floor.
Right. Well, and also, I wonder about how has the masonry held up in light of that, because with the severity of the winters in Minneapolis, I imagine when you provide that much insulation between what's happening inside the building and the wall, you're also exposing the wall to, the wall probably needs some of the heat from the inside to keep it, structurally sound, or to some extent, right? And when you create that insulation layer that now cuts that off, how does that wall hold up for the next 100 years in the light of these freeze-thaw cycles that happen, pretty severe freeze-thaw cycles that happen, right? I mean, that's another interesting thing that
it's actually snowing and thawing right now.
Yeah, that's right. I thought I have family in the Midwest that I've seen that as well. Yeah. So, all right, good. Well, I think it's good. I'm glad that you stuck with it, and I'm glad that you've been able to dig as deeply as you have with. I think it's great. I think it. Again, I think the whole point of picking a building that you're interested in is that it will, as you pull on these threads, things will start to
come to light that you just didn't expect, and then you'll become even more invested in finding these other things out. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, great. Have a good weekend.
You too.
All right.